let me tell you about my friend John Paul and why he'll never feel safe on land again. He wasn't the sort of person you'd expect to end up living on a yacht. He'd been a history teacher at a comprehensive in Glasgow for the better part of 20 years. The kind of steady, reliable guy who marked papers on Sunday evenings and took the same 2 weeks off every summer. Then everything changed when he won a raffle. It wasn't a huge win, mind you, but enough to transform his life. After all of the arrangements were sorted, he found himself the proud owner of a beautiful 45-foot motor yacht. She was a proper luxury vessel with polished wood fittings, a spacious salon, comfortable sleeping quarters, and all the modern amenities including satellite internet. He discovered he could teach online from anywhere with a stable connection, and the freedom of waking up to different horizons each morning was intoxicating. He'd been living aboard for about 18 months when I first visited him. The yacht was moored in a quiet bay off the Dorset coast, far enough from shore that the lights of the nearest village were just pinpricks in the darkness. He seemed genuinely happy for the first time since I'd known him, tanned from the sun and relaxed in a way that years of classroom management had never allowed. The boat was immaculate, well maintained and loved, with comfortable furnishings and enough space to feel like a proper home. Though when I mentioned how peaceful it must be, he glanced toward the shore with an expression I couldn't quite read. We spent the evening catching up over a few drinks, and as the conversation wound down, he mentioned something that stayed with me. He'd been exploring parts of the internet he'd never bothered with before, partly out of boredom during the long evenings at Anchor, partly from curiosity about what existed beyond the usual websites everyone used. He wasn't particularly technical, but he'd taught himself just enough networking to be dangerous. The hidden networks beneath the surface web fascinated him. The anonymity appealed to him, the sense of being able to observe without being observed. But over the past few weeks, he'd stumbled across something that unsettled him. A series of linked sites offering live streaming services, but not the kind you'd find on mainstream platforms. These streams showed real people in real situations, often without their knowledge, sometimes against their will. He described it as a network of interconnected feeds, some showing seemingly innocent content like people in their homes or workplaces, others displaying scenarios orchestrated for the viewer's entertainment. The most disturbing aspect was the interactive element. Viewers could influence what happened on screen through various means, turning passive observation into active participation. What bothered him most was how professional the operation appeared. This wasn't some amateur setup run by a handful of perverts in their spare time. The streaming quality was excellent, the user interface sophisticated, and the whole system seemed designed to handle thousands of concurrent viewers. Someone was running this with serious resources and technical expertise. The conversation moved on to other topics, but I could tell the subject was weighing on his mind. He had always been the sort of person who felt responsible for fixing problems, even when they weren't his to solve. I suspected he was wrestling with whether to report what he'd found, though to whom and with what evidence, I couldn't say. I left the next morning, returning to my own routine in London, and didn't think much more about our conversation until he called me a few weeks later. His voice was different, strained in a way I'd never heard before. The streaming network had evolved since our last conversation. New sections had appeared, offering more extreme content, and more people were watching. But the change that terrified him was personal. He'd recognized one of the locations being streamed. It was his yacht. The feed showed his main cabin from an impossible angle, as if the camera was positioned inside the paneling itself. He could see his comfortable seating area, his navigation station, even the books he'd left open on the polished dining table. The image quality was crystal clear, updating in real time, showing every detail of his private space. At first, he thought it might be some kind of technical error or coincidence, but when he moved around the spacious cabin, his actions reflected on the stream with no delay. Someone had somehow placed surveillance equipment inside his beautiful yacht without his knowledge. Thousands of strangers were watching his every move. The chat beside the stream was filled with comments about him, discussions of his daily routine, speculation about his background and personal life. Some viewers seemed to know details about his past that weren't publicly available, suggesting they'd researched him extensively. Others were making suggestions about what should happen next, treating his situation like entertainment. He had immediately started searching his vessel for hidden cameras, but found nothing obvious. The equipment had to be there somewhere, capturing video and audio, transmitting it to the streaming network, but it was concealed well enough that an amateur search revealed nothing. More troubling was the realization that this level of surveillance required serious planning and resources. Someone had accessed his boat, possibly multiple times, to install the necessary equipment. They'd studied his movements, learned his patterns, and chosen their moment carefully. This wasn't random targeting. It was a deliberate operation focused on him. He tried various approaches to regain his privacy. He covered every surface that might conceal a camera, disconnected his internet connection, even moved to different anchorages. But the stream continued, suggesting the surveillance system was more sophisticated than he'd initially thought. He attempted to contact other boat owners through marine radio, hoping to warn them or find allies, but his transmissions were met with silence or interference. The worst part was the interactivity and how quickly it escalated. The chat messages shifted from commentary to direct instructions, asking him to retrieve specific objects, move to certain areas of the boat, even step outside at designated times. At first, he dismissed them as trolls, but when he ignored the requests, strange disruptions followed. His GPS would drop out. The weather forecast he'd checked an hour earlier would suddenly show different data. His generator failed twice without clear cause. It was possible these were all coincidences, but the timing was too precise, too convenient. Someone was manipulating his environment, making his life aboard increasingly difficult, forcing him to comply with the viewer's wishes simply to maintain basic comfort and safety. He tried to report the situation to the authorities, but explaining the problem proved almost impossible. The streaming sites were accessible only through hidden networks. The evidence was ephemeral, and his situation sounded far-fetched even to his own ears. The police were polite but skeptical. The Coast Guard suggested he might be suffering from isolation-induced paranoia, and his internet service provider insisted their systems were secure. Meanwhile, the stream audience continued to grow. The viewer count reached several thousand, and the chat was now moderated by users who seemed to have administrative privileges. They organized the other viewers, coordinating their demands, turning his imprisonment into structured entertainment. The breaking point came when he realized the surveillance wasn't limited to his boat. The streaming network had expanded to include feeds from the shoreline, showing the bay where he was anchored, the nearby village, even the road leading to the marina. Someone was tracking his movements across a much wider area than he'd initially understood. Even more disturbing was the discovery that other boats in the area were also being monitored. The network included streams from various vessels, some with people aboard who seemed unaware they were being watched. Others apparently empty, but still under surveillance. The operation was far larger than a single yacht, covering what appeared to be the entire coastal region. He spent several sleepless nights trying to understand the scope of what he'd uncovered. The streaming network wasn't showing random locations. It was systematically monitoring a specific geographical area. Every boat, every building, every person within a certain radius was potentially being watched by thousands of anonymous viewers. He tried creating anonymous accounts on various forums, attempting to alert others to what was happening. But his posts were quickly deleted and his access revoked. When he tried to document the streams by taking screenshots, his computer would crash. Every attempt to gather evidence or reach out for help was somehow thwarted. The realization that he was trapped pushed him toward panic. He couldn't leave without being tracked, couldn't stay without being watched, couldn't contact anyone without his communications being monitored. Every choice he made was being observed and judged by an audience that viewed his situation as entertainment. The technical sophistication required for this level of surveillance was staggering. Someone had installed cameras and tracking equipment across miles of coastline, established a network capable of handling thousands of simultaneous video streams, and created a user interface that allowed viewers to interact with the content in real time. The resources involved suggested either a very wealthy individual or a well-funded organization with access to military-grade surveillance technology. His attempts to escape were also systematically thwarted. When he tried to sail away from the monitored area, his engine would develop problems, or his navigation equipment would malfunction. When he attempted to call for help, his radio would experience interference, or his mobile signal would disappear. Every route to freedom was blocked by technical difficulties that seemed too convenient to be accidental. The psychological pressure became unbearable. He was constantly aware of being watched, unable to relax even in what should have been the privacy of his own boat. He'd taken to sleeping in different locations each night, covering himself with blankets to avoid the cameras, but he knew these were futile gestures. The surveillance system was too comprehensive, too well designed to be defeated by such simple measures. The chat messages grew increasingly invasive, with viewers discussing intimate details of his life, making predictions about his behavior, treating him like a character in a reality television show. Some messages were sympathetic, expressing concern for his well-being, but others were cruel, suggesting ways to increase his distress for their amusement. He began to suspect that his situation was part of a larger experiment or entertainment program. The systematic nature of the surveillance, the careful manipulation of his environment, the organized response from the viewing audience all suggested a level of planning that went beyond simple voyeurism. The most terrifying aspect was the growing realization that escape might not be possible. The surveillance network covered such a wide area that leaving meant venturing into unknown territory, where the monitoring might be even more comprehensive. The technical capabilities demonstrated so far suggested resources and expertise that made traditional law enforcement seem inadequate to address the situation. Days passed. The isolation was absolute. He was surrounded by water, trapped in a situation that sounded so bizarre that even his closest friends would struggle to believe it. The anonymous viewers became his only connection to other people, but they saw him as entertainment rather than a human being in distress. During one of his more desperate attempts to trace the source of the stream, he stumbled across what looked like an internal admin panel, likely exposed through a forgotten link or outdated login. It wasn't polished or secure, but it revealed more than he was meant to see. There was a basic map showing streaming points all along the British coastline, with hundreds of active feeds, not just from boats, but from ports, coastal roads, even remote cottages. It became clear the system was organized. Different regions were broken up into sections, each apparently managed by separate user groups who shared data between them. The layout, the consistency, the scale of it all. This wasn't just some underground voyeur ring. The coordination and resources involved made it feel like something far more serious. He started to wonder if what he'd uncovered wasn't just a criminal enterprise, but part of a larger commercial or even state-run operation. The viewer numbers were staggering, reaching into the hundreds of thousands during peak times, with users paying substantial fees for access to different levels of content. The interactive elements allowed viewers to influence events in real time, creating a form of reality entertainment that generated enormous revenues for the operators. He said he found evidence suggesting that the operation had been running for several years, expanding gradually as the technology improved and the audience grew. The early streams had been crude and limited, but the current system was capable of providing high-definition video and audio from multiple angles, with sophisticated image processing that could track individuals even in crowded environments. The realization that he was just one of thousands of unwilling participants was both terrifying and oddly comforting. He wasn't being specifically targeted. He was simply unlucky enough to have discovered his own surveillance, while most others remained ignorant of theirs. But this knowledge also made his situation more hopeless. If the operation was as large and well-funded as the evidence suggested, then individual escape was unlikely. Our phone conversations became less frequent as his situation deteriorated. His voice grew weaker each time we spoke, the strain of constant vigilance taking its toll. He'd been eating poorly, sleeping in brief snatches, jumping at every sound that might indicate someone approaching his boat. The final call came a few weeks ago. He told me that something had changed about the streaming feeds. The cameras were still active, still transmitting his every move to the anonymous audience, but the interactive elements had been disabled. The viewers could watch, but no longer influence what happened to him. He interpreted this as a warning. His discovery of the administrative sections, his knowledge of the operation's scope, had marked him as a security risk. The psychological effect was devastating. Being watched for entertainment was horrible, but being watched as a potential threat was worse. He knew that any action he took, any attempt to contact authorities or escape his situation, would be immediately detected and countered. One morning, something changed. He woke to find his internet connection severed, his satellite communication system disabled, and his radio producing only static. For the first time in months, he was truly alone. The silence was both terrifying and liberating. Without the constant awareness of being watched, he felt a freedom he'd almost forgotten existed. But he also knew that this isolation was probably temporary, a prelude to something more permanent. The radio on his yacht crackled to life several days later. His hands shook as he reached for the handset, having heard nothing but static for so long that he'd almost forgotten what human voices sounded like. The transmission was clear and official, identifying itself as Falmouth Coast Guard. They were responding to reports of a vessel in distress, requesting his current position and status. His heart raced as he realized this might be his chance, his opportunity to finally escape the surveillance network that held him prisoner for so long. But as he prepared to respond, he noticed something that made his blood freeze. The radio display showed an incoming frequency that wasn't used by the Coast Guard, and the voice, while professional, had an undertone he recognized from his months of captivity. His finger hovered over the transmit button as he considered his options. He could share his exact position and hope for genuine rescue, or he could remain silent and maintain his current status as a managed prisoner. Either choice might be wrong, but only one offered the possibility of freedom. The voice repeated its request, growing more insistent, demanding his immediate response. He closed his eyes, made his decision, and pressed the button to share his coordinates. Imagine if the biggest mistake in your life came from being curious about something you saw in a film. That's what happened to my nephew, Tom, and it's why I can't sleep properly anymore. He was 16, the kind of kid who spent his weekends helping his gran with her garden and riding his bike down to the harbour to watch the fishing boats come in. Not the sort you'd expect to get mixed up in something dark. But that's the thing about curiosity. It doesn't discriminate. It started last autumn when he watched some thriller at the cinema in Truro about people being kidnapped and forced to perform for online audiences. The film made it seem like these things actually happened, that there were websites hidden beneath the normal internet where people paid to watch terrible things in real time. Most adults would have dismissed it as Hollywood nonsense. But 16-year-olds don't have that filter yet. Tom lived with his mum in Polperro, one of those picture postcard Cornish villages where everyone knows everyone, and the most exciting thing that usually happens is a tourist getting stuck in the narrow streets with a rental car. His dad had left when he was small, so it was just the two of them in a cottage overlooking the harbour. She worked at the local primary school and trusted him to be sensible while she was out. The trouble began when he started researching whether the film's premise was real. He found a Reddit thread discussing the movie, where users debated its authenticity. Most dismissed it as fiction, but a few claimed to know otherwise. One user posted a cryptic comment: "The rabbit hole goes deeper than Hollywood thinks. PM me if you're actually curious." Tom's curiosity got the better of him. He messaged the user, who responded with a YouTube link disguised as a tutorial for advanced internet privacy. The video seemed innocent enough. A bearded man in a basement explaining VPNs and encryption. But buried in the comments section were breadcrumbs, references to Tor, specific forum names, and invitation codes. It took him several weeks to work out how to access these hidden networks. The learning curve was steep, but he persisted, documenting his progress in a private Discord server he'd created. Looking back, that was his first mistake, creating a digital trail of his journey into the shadows. When he finally managed to connect, he spent hours exploring, fascinated by this parallel internet. Most of what he found was disappointing. Defunct forums, conspiracy sites, and pages that looked like they'd been abandoned for years. But he kept searching, following links and recommendations, going deeper into increasingly obscure corners. The breakthrough came when he found a forum dedicated to discussing the very type of content he'd seen in the film. Users shared links and recommendations with clinical detachment, discussing authenticity like film critics. Reading through the posts, he realized that what he thought was pure fiction might actually exist. The sites themselves were surprisingly primitive. Basic interfaces that looked like they'd been cobbled together by amateurs. Most required payments through complicated systems, but several offered preview sections that were freely available. The previews were disturbing enough. Grainy footage of people in windowless rooms, movements too natural to be acted, reactions too genuine to be scripted. What bothered him most was how organized it seemed, despite the amateur appearance. This wasn't random content uploaded by individuals. Someone was running a proper operation with regular schedules and systematic approach. The forums contained discussions about production quality, request systems, and expansion plans. From what he could gather, the operation was smaller than the film had suggested, but more real. It seemed to be an emerging network, testing methods and building capabilities rather than some vast established enterprise. The amateurish appearance was deliberate, designed to look like a few perverts with cameras rather than something more coordinated. The discussions revealed they were actively recruiting both participants and what they called local assets, people who could provide information about potential targets in their areas. They weren't just looking for victims. They needed intelligence gatherers, people who understood local dynamics and could spot opportunities. Tom's mistake was engaging with the forum using the same username he'd used elsewhere online. His digital footprint was surprisingly extensive. Gaming forums, social media, even school project submissions. Anyone looking could piece together his real identity, location, and interests within hours. The first sign they'd noticed him came through his Discord server. Files appeared that he hadn't uploaded. Screenshots of his own posts, maps of Polperro with his cottage marked, even photos of him taken from his school's website. Someone had been systematically cataloging his online presence. His laptop's webcam began activating randomly, the little light blinking on during the night. When he covered it, files on his desktop would be subtly altered, documents renamed, folders reorganized, photos edited with barely visible changes. They were demonstrating access to his digital life, showing him how completely they could invade his privacy. The psychological pressure was subtle but effective. His browsing history would be altered to include sites he'd never visited. His social media accounts would show login attempts from locations across the country. And his email would receive messages that seemed to know details about his daily routine. Sleep became almost impossible. He'd lie awake wondering if the webcam was recording, if his microphone was listening, if his every keystroke was being monitored. The laptop that had been his window to the world became a source of constant anxiety. The surveillance escalated when someone began asking questions about him in the village. His mum mentioned that a stranger had approached her at the school, claiming to be conducting research on rural internet infrastructure. The questions had been specifically about teenage online habits and computer literacy in the area. They'd identified him as potentially useful, a tech-savvy local teenager with detailed knowledge of the community, living in an area with limited police presence and isolated enough for discreet operations. But more than that, they needed a test subject for their Cornwall expansion, and Tom had unknowingly volunteered by documenting his journey into their world. The breakthrough came when he found evidence of their local operations. Forum posts discussed reconnaissance trips to Cornwall, photos of abandoned buildings within driving distance of Polperro, and conversations about the advantages of working in rural areas. They weren't just theoretically interested in his region. They were actively preparing to operate there. More disturbing was discovering that several local teenagers were already being discussed as potential targets. He recognized names from his school, descriptions of people he knew, references to family situations and social media activity. The users weren't just planning. They were already gathering intelligence. The realization that he might have accidentally identified himself as both an asset and a target hit him hard. His online activities had demonstrated his capabilities, whilst his location made him valuable for local intelligence. By exploring their world, he'd made himself visible to people who specialized in exploiting curiosity. The direct contact began with a message on his Discord server. "We know you've been watching. Time to be useful." Attached was a single photo, his bedroom window, taken from outside the cottage. The message was clear. They could reach him whenever they wanted. Instead of dramatic confrontations, they offered a simple arrangement: help with basic intelligence gathering, monitoring social media, noting when people traveled, identifying vulnerable individuals, and his online activities would remain private. refuse, and his browsing history would be shared with his mum, his school, the local police. The work started small. Screenshot certain social media posts, note when families mention holiday plans, track the online activity of specific teenagers. Nothing that seemed directly harmful, but each task connected him deeper into their operations. Tom tried to resist, but the leverage was too strong. They'd compiled a comprehensive dossier of his dark web exploration, complete with timestamps, screenshots, and a detailed analysis of his interests. His curiosity had been weaponized against him. The psychological control was masterful. They never threatened violence, never demanded anything obviously criminal. Instead, they gradually normalized his cooperation, making each new request seem like a natural progression from the last. His moral boundaries eroded through small compromises that individually seemed manageable. One autumn evening, the power went out across the peninsula during a storm. Not the dramatic blackout of horror films, but the kind of routine outage that rural areas experience regularly. Tom's mum went to stay with a friend whose house had a generator, leaving him alone in the cottage. 2 days later, a small package arrived with no return address. Inside was a USB drive and a single slip of paper with login credentials. The drive contained access to a private forum where his username was already recognized. His handlers had decided his period of basic intelligence gathering was over. It was time for more direct involvement. The USB drive contained detailed profiles of local teenagers, complete with photos, social media analysis, and vulnerability assessments. His job was to verify the information, add local context, and identify the most promising targets. His transformation from observer to participant was complete. He spent the next several hours reading through files that contained painfully detailed information about people he'd known all his life. The profiles weren't just demographic data. They included psychological assessments, family dynamics, and exploitation strategies. Someone had invested serious effort in understanding his community. By dawn, he understood his true role in their operation. He wasn't just providing intelligence, he was helping them select victims from his own community. His local knowledge, gained through a lifetime of village life, was being used to identify which of his neighbors were most vulnerable to manipulation. The trap had been perfectly constructed. His eagerness to understand had provided the initial contact. His digital footprint had given them leverage, and his local knowledge made him indispensable. Every choice he'd made since watching that film had led him deeper into their web. The network's activities in Cornwall expanded gradually over the following months. Tom's intelligence proved accurate and valuable, enabling them to operate with confidence in an area they'd never worked before. Every few weeks, they'd remind him they still had the files, just in case he forgot. His cooperation had made their expansion possible. The guilt was overwhelming. Missing person reports, worried parents, teenagers who disappeared for days before returning changed, all traced back to information he'd provided. His questions had been transformed into complicity, his knowledge into a weapon against his own community. The authorities remained unaware of the network's activities. They investigated individual incidents without recognizing the pattern, pursued obvious suspects without understanding the sophisticated recruitment and control methods being employed. Their traditional approaches were inadequate for addressing a threat this well organized. Tom's academic performance collapsed as the psychological pressure mounted. He started keeping lists of everything he said to everyone, terrified he might forget who knew what. Teachers noticed his declining grades and withdrawal from social activities, but attributed them to typical teenage stress. The real source of his problems couldn't be discussed with anyone. The network continued to grow, not through dramatic expansion, but through careful cultivation of assets like Tom. They were building a distributed operation using local knowledge and digital leverage to establish footholds in communities across the country. What had started as curiosity about a film had become participation in something far more sinister. The most disturbing realization was that Tom's story wasn't unique. The network's recruitment methods were systematic and repeatable, designed to convert questions into complicity. They were building a network of reluctant accomplices, each trapped by their own digital footprints and moral compromises. As I write this, Tom is still in Polperro, still providing intelligence, still carrying secrets that age him beyond his years. The boy who just wanted answers about a film has been replaced by someone who understands too much about the darkness that exists beneath the surface of normal life. The network continues to operate and expand, feeding on the natural inquisitiveness of young people who stumble across references to its activities. Each new recruit follows a similar path: initial questions, gradual involvement, eventual complicity. The cycle perpetuates itself, growing stronger with each iteration. But what haunts me most isn't Tom's story, or even the network's continued operation. It's the realization that right now, someone reading this might be wondering if such things could really exist. Someone might be inquisitive enough to start looking, to start searching, to take the first steps down a path that leads to the same destination. I still can't quite believe how quickly things went from normal to absolutely terrifying. 2 months ago, I was just a minicab driver in Newcastle, trying to make ends meet after losing my warehouse job. Now I'm hiding in a service station near Durham, and tomorrow night I'm supposed to help transport someone to their death in a Red Room broadcast that I've been unknowingly facilitating for weeks. I've been driving for Galaxy Cars for about 6 months. It's not glamorous work, late nights, drunk passengers, navigating through traffic for what works out to less than minimum wage most shifts. But after the warehouse closed down, it was the only job I could get that didn't require waiting weeks for security clearances or training courses. You just need a clean license, a reasonably decent car, and the ability to deal with difficult people. The job that changed everything started in early October. I got a call from the dispatcher about a regular booking, someone who needed transport twice a week, always the same route, always paid in cash. The customer was described as a professional gentleman who required discretion and reliability. The pay was better than usual, and regular bookings are gold dust in the minicab business. The passenger was a man in his 40s called Michael Stevens. He was always waiting outside when I arrived, always polite and professional, and never wanted to make small talk during the journey. The route was consistent: pick up from a residential address in Gosforth, drive to an industrial estate on the outskirts of the city, wait for about 2 hours, then drive him back home. Michael explained that he worked in media production and needed transport to a specialized facility where his company created content for online platforms. He said the work required unusual hours and that he preferred having a reliable driver rather than using different taxi services that might not understand his schedule. The industrial estate where I dropped Michael was one of those anonymous business parks filled with warehouses and small manufacturing units. The specific building he used was unmarked, with blackened windows and several high-end cars usually parked outside. During the 2-hour wait, I'd see other people arriving and leaving, all carrying equipment cases or technical gear. After several weeks of this routine, Michael started asking if I'd be interested in additional work. He needed someone to help with equipment transport, moving cameras, lighting gear, and computer systems between different locations. The pay was substantially better than driving, and Michael assured me the work was straightforward manual labor. I agreed to the additional work, partly for the money, and partly because I was curious about what kind of media production required such elaborate security and secrecy. Michael explained that his company created specialized content for niche audiences who paid premium rates for high-quality, authentic material. The equipment transport work involved loading and unloading professional-grade cameras, sophisticated lighting systems, and computer servers that seemed more advanced than anything I'd seen in normal television or film production. Everything was carefully packaged and required precise handling to avoid damage. Michael gradually introduced me to more aspects of his operation. He needed help setting up equipment in different locations, not just the industrial estate, but also residential properties and commercial spaces around Newcastle and the surrounding areas. The setups were always temporary, designed to be assembled quickly and dismantled without leaving traces. The locations varied, but they all shared certain characteristics: soundproofed rooms with controlled access, spaces that could be completely isolated from outside observation, and technical infrastructure that supported high-bandwidth internet connections. Michael explained that this variety was necessary for creating diverse content that would appeal to different audience preferences. As weeks passed, Michael began explaining more about his business model. His company produced what he called authentic interactive content for online platforms that specialized in realistic, unscripted material. Viewers paid substantial amounts for access to live streams that felt genuine rather than obviously staged or performed. The technical requirements for this content were demanding: multiple camera angles, professional lighting that could be adjusted in real time, audio systems that captured every detail, and streaming infrastructure that could handle thousands of simultaneous viewers without interruption. Michael's operation was sophisticated enough to meet these standards consistently. Michael also started discussing the importance of finding suitable performers for his content. He explained that the most valuable material featured people who provided authentic reactions to various situations. Viewers could distinguish between obvious acting and genuine responses. So his company specialized in creating scenarios that produced real emotions and reactions. About a month into the equipment work, Michael asked if I'd be interested in a different type of assignment. He needed someone to help with what he called scenario testing, essentially helping to verify that technical setups would work correctly for live broadcasts. The pay for this work was even better, and Michael assured me it was just technical verification rather than actual content creation. The scenario testing involved me spending time in the prepared spaces, while Michael operated the equipment from control rooms. He would test camera angles, audio levels, lighting configurations, and streaming quality by having me move through different positions and respond to various prompts he provided through the technical systems. Michael explained that this testing was essential because his audience expected flawless technical quality. Any problems with audio, video, or streaming could ruin the viewing experience and damage his company's reputation. The testing sessions helped ensure that everything would work perfectly during actual broadcasts. The testing became increasingly elaborate. Michael would simulate various scenarios, test my responses to different types of stimuli, and document my reactions to unexpected situations. He said this comprehensive testing helped his company understand how their technical setups would perform under the stress of live broadcasting. During these sessions, Michael would give detailed instructions about timing, positioning, and responses to different cues, follow specific movement patterns, react to various sensory inputs, demonstrate how someone might behave in challenging circumstances, He claimed this testing helped optimize the technical systems for capturing authentic human responses. 3 weeks ago, everything became clear in the most horrifying way possible. I was conducting what Michael had described as a final comprehensive test when I noticed that the monitors in the control room were displaying more than just local recording interfaces. Multiple screens showed dark web streaming platforms with view accounts indicating thousands of people watching live feeds. Michael's media production company wasn't creating content for mainstream online platforms. It was broadcasting live torture and murder to paying audiences on the dark web. The spaces I'd been helping to set up were red rooms, and I had been unknowingly preparing them for operation while gradually being recruited as their transport coordinator. The weeks of scenario testing had been training sessions, teaching me the locations and procedures I'd need to know as their logistics coordinator. My equipment transport and setup work had been gradually transformed into preparation for facilitating actual Red Room operations, moving victims and managing the technical infrastructure. Michael dropped all pretense when he realized I understood what was happening. He calmly explained that minicab drivers were ideal logistics coordinators for his operation. They could transport victims without raising suspicion, had legitimate reasons for visiting multiple locations, and could move equipment between sites as part of their normal work routine. The industrial estate facility was just one node in a larger operation that used multiple locations across the Northeast. Michael's company specialized in identifying and recruiting people whose jobs provided cover for the gradual conditioning process required to create authentic dark web content. My scenario testing sessions had been training me for tomorrow night's operation. I'd been learning the procedures for transporting unwilling victims, understanding the technical requirements for live broadcasts, and becoming familiar with the security protocols necessary for avoiding detection during actual Red Room events. I managed to escape while Michael was distracted with technical preparations, but I know his surveillance network extends far beyond the locations I'd visited. They've been monitoring my communications, tracking my movements through the minicab company's GPS systems, and building detailed profiles of my personal life. Since leaving Newcastle, I've been moving between different locations, but they keep finding me. Messages sent to my phone despite changing numbers, people who seem to recognize me at petrol stations and service areas, evidence that my movements are being tracked through methods I don't understand. Yesterday, I received a package at the bed and breakfast where I'd been staying. A package containing a sat-nav device that showed tomorrow night's pickup location and delivery route. Michael's operation had been preparing for months, and they expected me to transport their next victim to the prepared Red Room facility. The package included detailed information about tomorrow's victim, a young woman who had been selected and prepared through their recruitment network. They knew her routines, her vulnerabilities, and exactly how to get her into my car without raising suspicion. My role was to collect her and deliver her to the broadcast location. I could go to the police, but Michael has spent months creating evidence that would suggest I was a willing participant in his dark web activities. Galaxy Cars would have records of my regular bookings, my involvement in equipment transport, and my participation in what they would call training sessions that could be presented as voluntary preparation for criminal activity. Security cameras at the various locations would show me helping to set up equipment, following Michael's instructions, and participating in what could be characterized as preparation for facilitating kidnapping and murder. Without context, my actions would appear to show someone knowingly working as a logistics coordinator for dark web Red Room operations. Michael's operation is too sophisticated, too well established, too experienced at managing unwilling participants. The minicab industry provides perfect cover Drivers regularly visit unfamiliar locations, work irregular hours, and have legitimate reasons for transporting equipment and spending time in industrial areas. Tomorrow night, thousands of people will watch what Michael's audience has been anticipating for weeks. They've paid to see a carefully planned abduction and murder, and they expect their logistics coordinator to deliver the victim as promised. My months of unknowing preparation have led to this moment. I'm writing this from a service station toilet because it's one of the few places with constant lighting and regular security patrols. But I know they're still watching somehow. The sat-nav device included details about tomorrow's victim and pickup location, suggesting their operation extends to surveillance and recruitment networks I never suspected. In roughly 20 hours, I'll have to decide whether to collect the victim they've assigned me or refuse to participate and face the consequences. But Michael has demonstrated that his network can track me across multiple counties, and they have evidence that could destroy my life even if I don't complete tomorrow's assignment. The most terrifying realization is that Michael's operation probably uses multiple drivers simultaneously. How many other minicab drivers might be unknowingly transporting victims to Red Room facilities? How many regular bookings might be training operations for logistics coordinators who don't understand what they're really facilitating? The transport industry provides perfect access to isolated workers who visit unfamiliar locations, handle sensitive cargo, and are expected to maintain discretion about their passengers and destinations. It's an ideal setup for exploitation by people who understand how to gradually transform routine work into participation in something much darker. Michael's technical expertise allows him to maintain sophisticated surveillance and streaming operations while using legitimate transport needs as cover. His business credentials provide credibility, his security requirements deflect suspicion, and his resources allow him to maintain operations across multiple locations. Tomorrow's broadcast is being promoted as featuring a carefully orchestrated abduction using their trained logistics network. Michael's audience values the meticulous planning and professional execution that their driver coordination system enables. I never thought driving a minicab could lead to this kind of moral crisis. I thought the biggest risks were difficult passengers or road accidents. I never imagined that regular bookings could lead to becoming complicit in someone else's murder. The irony would be amusing if it weren't so terrifying. I spent months learning to become an accomplice to murder without knowing what I was training for. Tomorrow's broadcast is titled Perfect Delivery. Michael's audience is expecting a flawless abduction executed by their professionally trained logistics coordinator. And an innocent woman is going to die because I helped build the system that will kill her. The driver becomes the deliverer of death to someone who has no idea what's coming. And I still don't know if I'll show up or let them destroy my life for refusing to complete the delivery. So I've never actually told anyone this story before. Not fully anyway. It's been eating away at me for months, and I guess I need to get it out somehow. Just bear with me if I need to pause sometimes. It all started last November. You know how those dark winter nights in Bristol get? I was in this phase where I'd become weirdly obsessed with exploring the dark web. Nothing too crazy at first, just curiosity really. We all hear those stories, right? Urban legends about what's supposedly lurking in those hidden corners of the internet. I just wanted to see for myself. God, I was so naive. I'd spend most nights after work just browsing through these forums and marketplaces, telling myself I was just being an internet anthropologist, or some pretentious rubbish like that. The rain would be hammering against my window, and I'd be hunched over my laptop with this weird blue glow on my face, just scrolling and scrolling. I started recognizing usernames after a while, started following specific threads. You know how it goes. You tell yourself you're just looking, but you're getting pulled deeper with every click. There was this one user, Void Watcher they called themselves, who I'd see moderating a bunch of different forums. Seemed knowledgeable, intelligent. After a few weeks of seeing their comments, I stupidly felt like I knew them, like we had some kind of connection. Looking back now, it's so obvious they were grooming me, dropping these little personal details here and there that made me trust them. Classic manipulation, but I couldn't see it then. This one night, God, I remember the rain was absolutely hammering down. Void Watcher messages me directly, says there's this new streaming site that's pushing boundaries, and offers to send me a private link. I hesitated for maybe 5 seconds. There was this, this little voice saying, maybe this isn't such a good idea. But I'd convinced myself I was being careful, using a VPN, keeping anonymous, just observing, not participating. What was the harm in looking? That question, it just haunts me now, What was the harm in looking? The link just led to this bare bones page with a countdown timer. Nothing else, just white text on black. Stream begins 47:16. I remember thinking it was a bit weird, but also kind of intriguing. Void Watcher messaged again, saying it was an exclusive first viewing of something completely authentic. When I asked what exactly I'd be watching, they just said, real fear, real consequences, no actors, no scripts. I should have just shut everything down right then. Should have deleted my browsers, formatted my hard drive, walked away. Instead, and I'm not proud of this, I made a cup of tea, wrapped myself in this old blanket I had, and just waited. Convinced myself I could always disconnect if things got too intense. When the stream finally started, it was just nothing. An empty van interior, dark grey carpet on the walls, single overhead light, weird camera angle. Nothing happened for like 10 minutes, and I nearly convinced myself it was some art project or someone's idea of a joke. I was literally about to message Void Watcher when I saw movement. A door opened. Light flooded in for a second, then slammed shut. 2 figures were manhandling this third person who looked completely out of it. There was no sound, which made it even more disturbing. Just this silent struggle as they forced this person into the van and tied them up. My heart was racing. I was sweating. This didn't look fake. The movements were too frantic, too desperate. I should have closed the window, should have reported it. Instead, I just sat there frozen, telling myself it had to be some elaborate roleplay thing, even though deep down I knew. I just knew it wasn't. Then the camera angle suddenly changed, getting all jerky and unstable. It took me a minute to understand what I was seeing. They'd attached the camera to the person they grabbed. I was seeing everything from their perspective now. All the panicked movements as they struggled against whatever was holding them. That's when it hit me. It was some kind of collar or harness with a camera mounted on it. They turned this person into nothing but a walking viewpoint. Just an object carrying a camera for people like me to watch through. Text appeared at the bottom indicating viewpoint activation and bidding commencement. A counter showed 19 viewers, then 23, then 31. Another counter was showing what had to be cryptocurrency values just climbing higher and higher. That's when it fully hit me. This wasn't just some illegal content or whatever. This was, God, it's still hard to say it. It was a live stream where people were bidding to control what happened to this person. I was watching someone who'd been reduced to just content, their terror packaged up for people hiding behind anonymous connections. My hands were just hovering over my keyboard. Should I call the police? But what would I even say? How could I explain without getting myself in trouble? And where was this even happening? Could have been anywhere in the world. The van had nothing distinctive about it. The camera view went wild as they yanked the person to their feet. For just a second, they faced what looked like a mirror in the van, and I caught a glimpse of their face, young, maybe early 20s, with this crude device strapped around their neck. Their eyes, Christ, their eyes were just terror, pure terror. That split second of eye contact, even through all that technology and distance, it just cut through everything. This was real. This was happening right now to a real person. The bidding counter went crazy as they positioned the victim in the middle of the van. I could only see parts of the other people, gloved hands, dark jacket sleeve, lower half of a face behind a mask. I couldn't look away, couldn't move. By watching, I was part of this. My viewership was being counted. Text flashed across the screen announcing the completion of the first auction. Then these instructions appeared, just cold and clinical, detailing what would happen next based on the winning bid. I won't repeat what was written, what they were planning to do, what they wanted us to see through the eyes of someone who knew they were going to die. That's when the feed suddenly went still. The frantic movement stopped. The victim just froze, and the only movement was their rapid breathing causing tiny vibrations in the image. The silence in my flat was absolute. I hadn't even noticed the rain had stopped. In that awful stillness, I finally snapped out of it and slammed my laptop shut. I was shaking all over. Ran to the bathroom and threw up until there was nothing left. Sat on the bathroom floor for I don't know how long, trying to figure out what to do. Call the police. But what evidence did I have? How would I explain how I found that stream? After about an hour, I convinced myself I had to report it, whatever happened to me. I opened my laptop, ready to take screenshots, gather whatever information I could. But the stream was gone. The link went nowhere. My messages with Void Watcher had disappeared, like none of it had ever happened, except for the images burned into my brain and this crushing weight of having watched without doing anything. For weeks afterwards, I jumped at every notification, changed my locks, covered my webcam, spent nights wondering if someone had noted my presence on that stream, if they'd identified me somehow. But nothing happened. No police, no mysterious figures following me. Just life continuing like nothing had changed, when everything had. Sometimes I wonder if what I saw was real or some elaborate hoax, but then I remember those eyes in that brief reflection, that raw fear that no actor could fake, and I know. I haven't been back on the dark web, scrubbed my devices, changed all my habits, but the knowledge is still there, that beneath all our normal internet stuff, there are these places where people become nothing but content, where watching makes you part of it. The scariest part wasn't even what I saw in that van. It was realizing how easily I'd been led there, how quickly curiosity becomes complicity, and knowing that somewhere those streams are still happening. Those vans are still parked somewhere. Those cameras are still being strapped to people who disappear without anyone looking for them in the right places. Because who would know where to look? And who would admit to having seen them there? Sometimes I wake up and for a second, I think I'm wearing that collar, that people are watching through my eyes, waiting to bid. I don't think I'll ever feel truly alone again. I never thought I'd be sharing this story with anyone, but I need to get it off my chest before I lose my mind. You know how some experiences are so disturbing that you start to doubt whether they actually happened? That's where I've been for the past 3 months since that night at the Penumbra Gallery. I keep telling myself it couldn't have been real, that I imagined it all. But then I'll catch a news item about another missing person or see an advertisement for an exclusive art show. And it all comes flooding back. I tried going to the police, but the investigation went nowhere. It's like the whole thing has been wiped clean. And I can't shake the feeling that people with serious money and influence want to keep it that way. I've spent the last decade as an arts journalist for various online publications, specializing in the more experimental corners of the contemporary art world. My particular focus has been the intersection of technology and art, AI-generated exhibitions, VR installations, blockchain-authenticated pieces, that sort of thing. This naturally led me to develop an understanding of the darker aspects of digital culture, including the infamous corners of the dark web, where contraband and controversial content circulates beyond mainstream scrutiny. The invitation to the Penumbra Gallery opening arrived via an encrypted email from a source I'd previously interviewed for a piece on controversial digital art markets. The exhibition was titled Visceral Truth and promised to transcend the boundaries between observer and subject through revolutionary live performance techniques. The gallery was a pop-up in an abandoned warehouse in East London, operating for just 3 nights. My source mentioned that several wealthy collectors and dark web art dealers would be present, making it a valuable networking opportunity. The exclusivity appealed to me. Invitation only, no photography permitted, no public social media coverage. I'd attended similar underground exhibitions before and written anonymous reviews that earned me credibility in certain circles. This didn't seem particularly different from other avant-garde showings where the location is revealed only hours before the event. The night of the exhibition was unseasonably cold for September. I arrived at the warehouse at precisely 9 p.m., as instructed. The building looked derelict from the outside, broken windows patched with black plastic, graffiti covering the lower walls, no visible signage indicating an art event was occurring inside. Only the presence of a well-dressed doorman checking names against a tablet suggested anything legitimate was happening there. After verifying my identity and confiscating my mobile phone, standard practice for exclusive events seeking to prevent leaks, I was ushered through a series of black curtains into the main exhibition space. The transformation from decrepit exterior to polished gallery was impressive. The cavernous interior had been divided into various chambers using temporary walls, each space spotlessly white with professional lighting. Approximately 40 people milled about, drinking champagne from crystal flutes and speaking in hushed tones, a mixture of recognizable art world figures and individuals I suspected were the wealthy collectors my source had mentioned. The first few exhibition rooms featured relatively conventional shock art, photographs of extreme body modifications, video installations showing ritual scarification, sculptures made from what appeared to be preserved animal remains. Provocative, certainly, but nothing particularly groundbreaking for someone familiar with this corner of the art world. I remember thinking the exhibition was surprisingly tame, given the secretive nature of the invitation. It wasn't until I reached the central chamber that things began to feel genuinely unsettling. This room was larger than the others, with a raised circular platform in the center, surrounded by gallery-style seating. A sign indicated this would be the location of the evening's live performance, scheduled to begin at 11 p.m. What caught my attention, however, was the unusual technical setup. multiple cameras on tripods positioned around the platform, connected to a sophisticated-looking control station where a man in black adjusted settings on several monitors. I overheard fragments of conversation that initially seemed like typical art world pretension, but took on more disturbing connotations in retrospect. Phrases like authentic reaction capture and unfiltered visceral response were exchanged alongside what sounded like technical terminology about stream quality and connection security. One particularly animated conversation near me included mention of premium access packages and cryptocurrency-only transactions. At 10:30 p.m., attendees were encouraged to view the final exhibition room before the performance began. This space contained what appeared to be documentation of previous performances. Photographs showing individuals in various states of distress, their bodies adorned with what I assumed were elaborate makeup effects simulating wounds, burns, and other injuries. The accompanying placards described these as consensual transformative experiences and the ultimate surrender of bodily autonomy in service of artistic truth. The technical proficiency was impressive. I remember commenting to another attendee about the realistic nature of the effects. He smiled in a way that made me deeply uncomfortable, remarking that the Penumbra Collective was known for its commitment to authenticity. As 11 p.m. approached, we were guided back to the central chamber. The lights had been dimmed except for those illuminating the platform, creating a theatrical atmosphere. A woman in a sleek black dress circulated with a tablet, collecting email addresses from attendees who wished to receive the full documentation package. I provided mine, assuming this referred to photographs of the performance, or perhaps a digital catalogue. The gallery director, a tall, angular woman with silver hair, stepped onto the platform to introduce the evening's performance. Her explanation was a nauseating mix of artistic jargon and philosophical posturing about confronting the reality of human fragility and democratizing the experience of suffering. She explained that the performance would be live-streamed to private collectors and patrons unable to attend in person, and that interaction between the physical and virtual audiences would form part of the experience. When the performer was led onto the platform, something felt immediately wrong. Unlike the confident, self-possessed individuals usually found in performance art, this man moved hesitantly, his eyes darting around the room with unmistakable fear. He was young, perhaps mid-20s, thin and pale with numerous tattoos. His wrists bore marks suggesting recent restraint, though these could have been makeup effects consistent with the exhibition's aesthetic. Two assistants positioned him in the center of the platform, securing his ankles to hidden anchor points on the floor. The gallery director explained this was for stability during the transformative process. But his increasing agitation suggested whatever was about to happen wasn't entirely consensual. The realization dawned on me with sickening clarity when the control station operator announced that the stream was live and bidding could commence. On the monitors, I could see what appeared to be a chat interface filled with usernames and cryptocurrency amounts. The gallery director began describing potential modifications while gesturing to different areas of the young man's body, each suggestion corresponding with flurries of activity in the chat. This wasn't performance art simulating harm. It was actual torture being live-streamed to paying viewers on the dark web, disguised as an avant-garde exhibition for a carefully selected in-person audience who were either complicit or, like me, had been duped into providing legitimacy to the event. I felt frozen in place as the first procedure began. A small but unmistakably real incision on the man's shoulder, performed with surgical precision by one of the assistants now wearing latex gloves. The victim's muffled scream cut through the appreciative murmurs of the audience. On the monitors, bids increased rapidly as viewers requested specific modifications. I should have left immediately, should have found help. But a paralyzing mixture of disbelief and fear kept me rooted to my seat. Surely this couldn't be real. Perhaps it was an elaborate hoax designed to provoke exactly the horror I was feeling. The attendance of respected art world figures seemed to support this hypothesis. I desperately clung to this explanation, even as the evidence before my eyes became increasingly difficult to rationalize away. The true turning point came when I made eye contact with the victim. There was no performance in his terror, no artistic statement in his suffering. In that moment of connection, I knew with absolute certainty that I was witnessing something genuinely monstrous. I rose to leave, trying to appear casual, claiming to need the toilet when questioned by one of the staff. Instead of directing me to facilities, however, he insisted on escorting me, his hand firmly gripping my elbow in a way that suggested leaving wasn't truly an option. In the hallway outside the main chamber, I encountered the gallery director engaged in conversation with two attendees. They were discussing private commissions and customized experiences in terms that made it clear the night's performance was merely an introduction to services offered through more discreet channels. When they noticed me, the conversation halted abruptly. The director approached, asking pointed questions about my publication and how I'd received my invitation. Her previously performative warmth had vanished, replaced by calculated assessment. When I mentioned my source, her expression shifted subtly, and she exchanged a glance with my escort that made my blood run cold. What followed was presented as a special tour of the artist's preparation area, but felt unmistakably like being taken into custody. I was led through a service door into the warehouse's back rooms, where the carefully constructed gallery aesthetic gave way to the building's industrial reality. In one room, computer equipment far more sophisticated than necessary for a simple art installation processed what appeared to be multiple live streams. In another, 3 frightened-looking individuals, similar in appearance to the performer on the platform, sat huddled under the watch of a security guard. The director explained in the same poised, articulate manner she'd used during the performance introduction that I had been granted access to privileged information and would need to sign extensive non-disclosure agreements. The alternative, implied rather than stated explicitly, involved joining those awaiting performance opportunities. I signed whatever was placed before me, my hand shaking so violently I barely recognized my own signature. The documents included clauses about artistic confidentiality and performance ethics that thinly disguised their true purpose: to silence witnesses to criminal activity. After what felt like hours but was probably only 45 minutes, I was returned to the main gallery space where the performance continued. The victim was still conscious, but clearly in shock, his body now bearing multiple modifications that would leave permanent scars at best. The audience watched with the detached appreciation of conventional gallery patrons, occasionally consulting their phones, presumably to follow the online auction determining what would happen next. I remained only long enough to avoid suspicion, then claimed illness and requested to leave. My phone was returned, but when I checked it later, I discovered all photos from that day had been deleted, and the device had been reset to factory settings. In the following days, I attempted to report what I'd witnessed to the police. Their initial interest waned rapidly after they visited the warehouse, finding it empty with no evidence of the gallery's existence. The names I provided led nowhere, The Penumbra Collective had no official registration, the gallery director was untraceable, and the building's ownership was buried under layers of shell companies. A week later, I received an email containing only a link. Against my better judgment, I clicked it, finding myself on a password-protected site that appeared to be a catalogue of performances available for private commission. The thumbnail images were mercifully blurred, but recognizable enough that I could identify the young man from the exhibition among them. The final message arrived yesterday, a digital invitation to the next Penumbra event, scheduled for next month at an undisclosed location. The invitation included a personal note mentioning how my journalistic perspective had been particularly valuable and suggesting I might wish to participate more directly in future performances. I've deleted my email accounts, changed my phone number, and am staying with a friend while I arrange more permanent relocation. But I know these precautions are likely insufficient. The Penumbra Collective operates at the intersection of the art world and the dark web, with connections and resources beyond what conventional authorities can easily trace. Every gallery opening I see advertised now fills me with dread. Every art performance a potential front for unimaginable cruelty. The boundary between provocative creativity and genuine atrocity has been irrevocably blurred in my mind. And somewhere, I know the next exhibition is already being prepared, with new performers selected and wealthy patrons eagerly awaiting their invitations. Imagine discovering that your teenage daughter knows more about the darkest corners of the internet than you could ever comprehend, and that her knowledge isn't theoretical. I teach journalism at Leeds University, specializing in digital media ethics. It's the sort of academic position that sounds more exciting than it actually is. Mostly grading essays about social media responsibility and explaining libel law to students who think Twitter is a primary source. My expertise extends to understanding how information spreads online, but I'd never ventured beyond the surface web until my daughter forced my hand. Emma came home from sixth form last autumn with what she called a special project. She'd convinced her media studies teacher to let her write about online anonymity and digital crime for her A-level coursework. The teacher had approved it, thinking she'd write about cyberbullying or identity theft, the usual teenage internet horror stories. Emma had something much more ambitious in mind. She asked me to help her access what she called the hidden internet. She knew I'd written academic papers about digital journalism and assumed I'd have the technical knowledge to guide her research. The truth was, I understood the theory, but had never actually explored these networks myself. Still, she was my daughter, and this was legitimate academic work. How dangerous could supervised research really be? We spent an evening setting up the necessary software on her laptop. Emma was surprisingly well informed about the process, mentioning specific browsers and security protocols that I had to look up as we went along. She claimed to have learned everything from YouTube tutorials and online forums, but her knowledge seemed more comprehensive than casual research would explain. Her project proposal was methodical and well structured. She wanted to document how illegal marketplaces operated, how anonymity was maintained, and how law enforcement attempted to monitor these activities. She planned to observe and document, not participate. It seemed like exactly the sort of investigative work that would impress university admissions committees. The first few weeks went smoothly. Emma would spend a couple of hours each evening browsing various sites, taking screenshots, and making notes about what she observed. She showed me drug marketplaces, weapon sales, and document forgery services, Everything was exactly what I'd expected. Seedy, obviously illegal, but ultimately just digital storefronts for familiar crimes. She was particularly interested in how these sites built trust between anonymous users. She documented reputation systems, escrow services, and community guidelines that governed illegal transactions. Her analysis was sophisticated, noting how these platforms replicated legitimate e-commerce features while operating completely outside legal frameworks. Then she discovered the entertainment sections. Emma mentioned them casually during one of our research sessions, describing live streaming services that offered what she called extreme content. She was vague about specifics, focusing instead on the technical aspects: how payments were processed, how viewers were verified, how streams were protected from outside monitoring. I should have been more curious about her evasiveness. Emma had been remarkably detailed about everything else she'd encountered, but when discussing these streaming services, she became almost professionally distant. She spoke about them like a researcher cataloguing specimens, not a teenager encountering disturbing material for the first time. Her coursework notes from this period show a troubling shift in focus. Instead of broadly documenting illegal activities, she began concentrating specifically on what she termed interactive entertainment platforms. Her research became more targeted, more technical, and considerably more secretive. She stopped showing me her daily findings, claiming she needed to organize her material before sharing it. When I asked direct questions about what she was discovering, she'd deflect by discussing technical challenges or asking about legal frameworks surrounding digital evidence collection. Around Christmas, Emma's behavior started changing in subtle ways. She became more withdrawn, spending longer periods alone in her room. She'd always been somewhat solitary, but now she seemed actively to avoid family interaction. When she did engage in conversation, she seemed distracted, as though part of her attention was always elsewhere. Her sleep patterns shifted dramatically. I'd hear her moving around the house at 2 or 3 in the morning, using the kitchen or bathroom with the careful quietness of someone trying not to wake others. When I mentioned this, she claimed to be working on her project during late-night hours when internet connections were more stable. In January, she asked me about legal protections for journalists and researchers. Specifically, she wanted to know about circumstances where witnessing illegal activity might require reporting to authorities, and what protections existed for academic research that involved observing criminal behavior. I explained the general principles. Journalists had some protections for source confidentiality, but no absolute immunity from reporting serious crimes. Researchers were expected to maintain ethical boundaries and weren't protected from prosecution if they participated in illegal activities rather than simply observing them. Emma listened carefully and asked several follow-up questions about where exactly the line existed between observation and participation. She seemed particularly interested in scenarios where researchers might influence events they were supposedly just documenting. Her questions made me uncomfortable, but I assumed they were theoretical concerns for her coursework. I encouraged her to discuss any ethical dilemmas with her teacher or the University Ethics Board if she was considering more advanced research. February brought the first real warning sign that something was seriously wrong. Emma received a package addressed to her personally, delivered by private courier rather than regular post. When I asked about it, she claimed it was research material she'd ordered online. The package was small, roughly the size of a smartphone box, but she handled it with unusual care and took it directly to her room. Later that day, I noticed she'd rearranged her bedroom setup. Her laptop was now positioned differently, with what looked like additional equipment connected to it. When I asked about the new hardware, she explained that she needed better audio recording capabilities for her project. The equipment didn't look like standard recording gear. There were small cameras, additional monitors, and what appeared to be professional-grade lighting equipment. For a project that was supposed to involve observing existing content, she seemed to be setting up for content creation. Around the same time, Emma began receiving phone calls from unknown numbers. She'd always answer them privately, usually taking the calls outside or in her room with the door closed. The conversations were brief, and she never volunteered information about who was calling or why. When I asked directly, she claimed they were interviews with academic contacts she'd found. Through her research, she said she was speaking with digital rights activists and cybersecurity researchers who preferred telephone communication for security reasons. The explanation was plausible enough, but something about her demeanor during these calls troubled me. She seemed nervous rather than excited, as though the conversations were stressful rather than informative. In March, Emma asked for help accessing university library databases that required staff credentials. She needed academic papers about legal precedents for digital evidence and international jurisdiction issues surrounding online crimes. The research she was requesting seemed far beyond the A-level requirements. She was looking for case studies involving cross-border prosecution of internet crimes, specific technical details about how digital evidence was collected and verified, and legal analysis of situations where criminal activity was documented by civilians. I helped her access the databases, but I began reviewing the papers she was downloading. The material was genuinely academic, but it painted a disturbing picture of her research interests. She was clearly preparing for scenarios that went far beyond passive observation of illegal activities. One evening in early April, while Emma was out, I decided to examine her laptop more closely. I know this violated her privacy, but her behavior had become concerning enough that I felt parental supervision was warranted. What I found was worse than I'd imagined. Her browser history showed dozens of visits to sites I'd never heard of, with names that suggested extremely disturbing content. But more troubling were the accounts she'd created on various platforms, accounts with usernames and profile information that suggested she wasn't just observing these communities. She'd been actively participating in discussions about what appeared to be live-streamed violence. Her posts showed detailed knowledge of how these streams operated, who organized them, and how viewers could influence what happened during broadcasts. Most disturbing were her private messages with other users. The conversations suggested she'd moved beyond research and begun actively engaging with people who organized and participated in these activities. Some messages included references to meeting in person and participating in what they called production activities. The timeline of these communications showed a clear progression from curious observer to active participant over the course of several months. By the most recent messages, Emma was discussing specific dates, locations, and her potential role in upcoming events. I sat in her room for nearly an hour, reading through months of communications that revealed my daughter had become involved in something far more serious than academic research. The technical equipment in her room wasn't for recording observations, it was for broadcasting content. When Emma returned home that evening, I was waiting in the kitchen with printouts of her most concerning communications. I decided that direct confrontation was the only option remaining. Her reaction was not what I'd expected. Instead of denial or defensiveness, Emma seemed almost relieved that I'd discovered her activities. She sat down across from me and calmly began explaining what she'd been doing for the past several months. She confirmed that her project had begun as legitimate research, but she'd been recruited by people who recognized her intelligence and academic approach to understanding their operations. They'd offered her opportunities to move from observer to participant, initially in minor technical roles. Emma described how she'd been gradually introduced to more serious activities, always with the assurance that her involvement was minimal and primarily technical. She'd been told that her academic background made her valuable for documentation and analysis rather than direct participation in what she carefully termed the entertainment aspects. She explained that the equipment in her room was for quality control and technical support rather than primary content creation. Her role was to monitor streams, manage viewer interactions, and ensure technical problems were resolved quickly. Emma spoke about all of this with disturbing matter-of-factness, as though she were describing a part-time job rather than participation in serious criminal activity. She seemed to view her involvement as a natural progression from research to practical application of her knowledge. What made her explanation most chilling was her obvious intelligence and careful consideration of legal and ethical implications. This wasn't a naive teenager being manipulated by criminals. This was someone who understood exactly what she was involved in and had made calculated decisions about her level of participation. She'd researched legal precedents, understood jurisdiction issues, and carefully structured her involvement to minimize personal risk while maintaining plausible deniability. Her academic approach to criminal activity was more disturbing than simple recklessness would have been. Emma finished her explanation by noting that she'd been expecting this conversation for several weeks. She'd known her activities would eventually be discovered and had prepared responses to the questions she anticipated I'd ask. She had plans for managing the situation, including strategies for ending her involvement if necessary, and methods for ensuring that any evidence of her participation would be difficult to verify or prosecute. We sat in the kitchen until nearly 3 a.m, discussing her involvement in activities I could barely comprehend. Emma answered my questions with clinical precision, explaining technical details and legal considerations with the expertise of someone who'd spent months studying every aspect of what she was doing. By the end of our conversation, I understood that my daughter had become someone I didn't recognize. The intelligent, methodical approach that had always made me proud of her had been applied to activities that horrified me. Emma went to bed that night with the promise that we'd continue our discussion the following evening. She seemed confident that she could convince me her involvement was manageable and that the risks were acceptable given the financial and educational benefits she was receiving. I stayed awake until dawn, trying to decide what options were available to me. Calling the police would certainly end Emma's involvement, but it would also destroy her future and potentially put her in physical danger from people who trusted her with sensitive information. Attempting to force her to stop might simply drive her activities underground, making them more dangerous and removing any possibility of monitoring or influencing her choices. The most disturbing realization was that Emma was probably right about the legal risks. Her involvement had been carefully structured to avoid direct participation in the most serious crimes, and her academic credentials provided plausible explanations for much of her knowledge and activity. 3 days later, Emma left for what she claimed was a university visit in Birmingham. She took the train on Friday morning, planning to return Sunday evening after attending information sessions and campus tours. She never came back. Her phone goes straight to voicemail. Her social media accounts were deactivated the day she left. The university she claimed to be visiting has no record of her registration for any information sessions. The equipment in her room is gone, along with her laptop and most of her personal belongings. She left behind only her school textbooks and a note saying she'd contact me when it was safe to do so. It's been 8 months since Emma disappeared. I've reported her missing, but without evidence of foul play. The police investigation has been minimal. A 17-year-old who left voluntarily with her own belongings, and documentation isn't considered high priority. I've tried to trace her digital activities, but the accounts and platforms I discovered have either been deleted or require technical access I don't possess. The academic research that started everything is still on our home computer, but it reveals nothing about where she might have gone or who she might be with. Sometimes I receive text messages from unknown numbers with just a few words confirming that she's safe. The messages come from different locations around the country, never the same number twice, always brief enough to avoid meaningful conversation. I know Emma is alive and apparently unharmed, but I don't know what she's become or whether I'll ever see her again. The intelligent, methodical daughter I raised has disappeared into a world I helped her access, using skills I encouraged her to develop. The worst part is knowing that everything she did was logical and well planned. Emma didn't stumble into danger through poor judgment or teenage impulsivity. She made careful, calculated decisions that led her away from everything I thought we'd built together. Her A-level coursework is still in her room. 90 pages of detailed analysis about digital crime and online anonymity. It's brilliant work, demonstrating exactly the sort of critical thinking and research capability that should have led to university admission and a successful academic career. Instead, it reads like a manual for everything that happened afterward. I didn't recognize my reflection when I first saw it. Not immediately. It took a few seconds of staring at the screen before I realized I was looking at my own face, slightly distorted by the camera angle, but unmistakably me. My living room was behind me, dimly lit by the lamp I'd left on earlier. The image was grainy, but clear enough. What wasn't clear was how this live stream existed at all. Let me back up. I'm a cybersecurity consultant, not one of those high-level experts who protects government networks or counters state-sponsored hackers. My work involves helping small businesses implement basic security protocols, conducting vulnerability assessments for local companies, and occasionally assisting with data recovery. It's honest work that pays the bills, but it's rarely exciting. 3 weeks ago, a new client contacted me, a mental health clinic concerned about patient confidentiality after several employees reported strange network behaviors. When I arrived at their office, the clinic director explained their concerns with obvious discomfort. Several therapists had noticed their session recordings being accessed at odd hours, despite the files supposedly being secured in an encrypted system. Nothing had been stolen or altered as far as anyone could tell, but the access logs showed viewing activity during overnight hours when no staff should have been working. My initial assessment revealed a surprisingly sophisticated breach. Someone had created a backdoor into their network that bypassed standard security measures. This wasn't the work of an opportunistic hacker or disgruntled employee with basic skills. Whoever did this knew exactly what they were doing. I isolated the compromised systems, implemented temporary security measures, and began the deeper forensic work of tracking the intrusion to its source. The digital trail led me through multiple proxy servers and anonymous networks. Whoever had accessed the clinic's files had taken elaborate precautions to hide their tracks. After days of careful analysis, I managed to identify a pattern in the connection timestamps. The access always occurred between 1 a.m. and 3 a.m., always on Tuesdays and Fridays, and always targeted the same subset of patient files: recordings of therapy sessions dealing with trauma, abuse, or severe anxiety disorders. My report to the clinic detailed the technical aspects of the breach and recommended comprehensive security upgrades. What I didn't include was my growing suspicion about the nature of the intrusion. This wasn't typical cybercrime seeking financial data or identity information. This was targeted surveillance of people's most vulnerable moments. The precision and pattern suggested something beyond simple data theft. Professional ethics dictated that I should complete my contract, submit my findings, and move on to the next client. But something about this case gnawed at me. The deliberate targeting of trauma patients felt predatory in a way that cybercrime rarely does. Most hackers I've encountered are motivated by financial gain or technical challenge, not the systematic observation of human suffering. After completing my official work for the clinic, I continued tracking the intrusion pattern on my own time. Using a secured system isolated from my personal network, I created digital breadcrumbs designed to attract the attention of whoever had breached the clinic's security. I set up dummy files mimicking the naming conventions of therapy recordings, embedded with unique markers that would help me trace anyone who accessed them. For 2 weeks, nothing happened. Then on a Tuesday night, my monitoring system alerted me to activity. Someone had taken the bait, accessing my dummy files through the same sophisticated methods used on the clinic's network. This time, I was prepared. As they downloaded my files, I deployed a specialized tracking script designed to pierce through proxy defenses and reveal connection origins. What I found led me to a series of encrypted channels on the dark web. Using anonymous browsing tools, I followed the digital trail to a nondescript forum that required Bitcoin payment for access. The page was minimalist, black background, simple text navigation, no graphics or branding. The site called itself The Witness Room and claimed to offer authentic moments of human vulnerability for discerning observers. I paid the entry fee using an anonymous cryptocurrency wallet and gained basic access to the forum. The site was organized into categories with clinical-sounding names: trauma responses, grief manifestations, anxiety episodes, confessional moments. Each category contained dozens of live streams and recorded videos. The view counts were low, usually under 50, but the payment required for each viewing was substantial. The first video I accessed showed a therapy session similar to those from the clinic. A person describing a traumatic experience to an off-camera therapist, unaware they were being observed by paying strangers on the internet. Other videos showed people alone in bedrooms or living spaces, experiencing panic attacks, crying, or engaging in compulsive behaviors. All appeared to be recorded without the subject's knowledge. The site's premium section required additional payment and verification. After another cryptocurrency transfer and a waiting period of 24 hours, I gained access to this restricted area. Here, the content was categorized differently: direct engagement, controlled scenarios, live requests. The first live stream I accessed in this section showed an empty room with white walls and a single chair. Text on screen indicated that the broadcast would begin in 17 minutes and that scenario parameters had already been established by primary observers. A chat window showed usernames discussing technical aspects of the upcoming stream: camera angles, lighting requirements, audio quality. The clinical detachment of their conversation struck me as more disturbing than explicit anticipation would have been. I didn't stay to watch whatever was scheduled to occur in that room. Instead, I methodically documented the site structure, user patterns, and technical infrastructure. The operation was sophisticated, with multiple layers of security and anonymization. This wasn't some amateur effort. It had the hallmarks of an organized network with significant resources. After gathering sufficient information, I prepared a detailed report for federal law enforcement. I included everything I had discovered about the witness room, its connection to the clinic breach, and my analysis of how the operation functioned technically. I submitted the report through official channels, expecting to be contacted for follow-up information. A week passed with no response. I sent a follow-up inquiry and received an automated acknowledgement, but nothing substantive. After 10 days, I called the field office directly and was told my report had been received and forwarded to the appropriate department. The agent I spoke with seemed disinterested, almost dismissive. Frustrated by the lack of official response, I intensified my own investigation. I created a more comprehensive mapping of the witness room's network infrastructure, identifying potential server locations and administrative access points. I catalogued user patterns, payment flows, and content distribution methods. Each layer I uncovered revealed greater complexity and more disturbing implications. The live streams weren't just recordings of therapy sessions or private moments captured through compromised security systems. Some appeared to be deliberately staged scenarios where individuals were placed in situations designed to trigger emotional responses. The controllers would manipulate environmental factors, sounds, temperature, lighting, while observers in the chat suggested specific triggers to elicit desired reactions. 3 weeks into my investigation, I discovered something that fundamentally changed my understanding of what I was dealing with. Hidden in the site's technical architecture was a secondary network, a parallel system that monitored the observers themselves. Every user of the witness room was being recorded while they watched. Keystrokes logged, webcams quietly activated, microphones capturing ambient sounds. The watchers were also being watched. This discovery led me to a deeper level of the operation, accessed through a different entry point entirely. Here, the content consisted entirely of recordings of people watching the witness room streams, close-up footage of faces as they observed others suffering, metadata tracking their viewing patterns, physiological responses measured through subtle analysis of facial movements and breathing patterns. This meta-observation had its own audience, paying even higher premiums for access. I was documenting this secondary system when I noticed something odd about one of the observer recordings. The timestamp showed it was from the previous night, during hours when I had been accessing the witness room myself. With growing unease, I opened the file. The video showed a man sitting at a desk, illuminated by the blue glow of a computer monitor. The camera angle suggested a webcam perspective, looking slightly down at the subject. His face showed subtle expressions of concentration, occasional discomfort, and clinical interest. It took me several seconds to recognize my own reflection, captured from my laptop's camera, that I thought had been securely disabled. The video continued for over an hour, showing me methodically investigating the witness room, taking notes, examining different streams. Occasional metadata appeared on screen. My heart rate estimated through facial blood flow analysis, my pupil dilation tracked when viewing disturbing content, timestamps correlating my viewing patterns with specific website areas. Everything I had done to investigate them had provided them with content for their meta-observation network. I immediately shut down my system, disconnected from all networks, and physically removed the camera and microphones from my devices. I swept my apartment for hidden surveillance devices, finding nothing obvious but remaining unconvinced. The realization that I had become content for the very system I was investigating created a nauseating feedback loop of paranoia. That night, I carefully constructed a new secure system using components that had never been connected to my home network. I used this to draft detailed reports for multiple law enforcement agencies, journalistic organizations, and cybersecurity threat centers. I included all my evidence, analysis, and personal observations, sending each report through different anonymous channels. 2 days later, I received an email to my personal account, the one I had not used for any part of this investigation. The subject line contained only a timestamp matching exactly when I had sent my reports. The body of the email was empty, but attached was a video file. Against all better judgment, I opened it on an isolated device. The video showed my apartment from multiple angles, views from devices that should not have existed, my television, computer monitor, phone screen, even my refrigerator with its smart display. All showed the same image. Me, sitting at my desk, drafting reports about the witness room. The footage zoomed in on my face, analyzing my expressions as I worked. Text appeared on screen. Subject demonstrates obsessive behavior patterns consistent with trauma response category 4B. Continued observation recommended. I abandoned my apartment that night, taking nothing electronic with me. I checked into a hotel using cash, bought a disposable phone, and contacted the few people I truly trusted. One friend in law enforcement agreed to meet me the following day. She arrived at our meeting location visibly uncomfortable. When I began explaining my findings about the witness room, she stopped me mid-sentence. Her department had received my report, she confirmed, but it had been flagged and reclassified almost immediately. She wasn't authorized to discuss the details, but her message was clear. Powerful interests were involved, and pursuing this further would have consequences. I spent the next week moving between hotels, using public computers to monitor for any signs that my reports had generated action. Nothing appeared in news outlets or public records. No investigations were announced. The witness room continued operating without disruption. 10 days after leaving my apartment, I received a text on my disposable phone, a phone whose number I had shared with exactly 3 people. The message contained only a website address. Against every rational instinct, I accessed it from a public computer. The page showed a live stream of the hotel room I had checked into that morning. The bed was empty, the room unoccupied. I was sitting in the hotel lobby as I viewed the stream. A timer in the corner showed the broadcast had been active for 3 hours. The view count displayed the number 7. The stream title was simply my full name followed by Observation Phase 2. That was yesterday. I've since crossed state lines, abandoned all electronic devices, and withdrawn cash to live on while I consider my options. I'm writing this account by hand, planning to have it typed and distributed by someone with no connection to me or this situation. I don't know exactly what the witness room is or who operates it. The technical sophistication suggests resources beyond typical criminal organizations. The apparent immunity from law enforcement implies protection or participation at institutional levels. The methodical nature of their observation network indicates purpose beyond voyeurism or profit. What I do know is that somewhere, right now, someone is watching a live stream of a person who doesn't know they're being observed. Someone is paying to witness another human being's vulnerable moments. Someone is analyzing reactions, cataloging responses, building profiles of both the observed and the observers. And increasingly, I suspect that the true purpose of the witness room isn't the content it provides to its users. The real product is the understanding of human psychology that comes from watching people watch others. The multi-layered observation that reveals patterns of behavior, predictors of response, blueprints of manipulation. I check for cameras everywhere now, not just obvious devices, but any object that could potentially house monitoring equipment. I vary my routines, change my appearance, avoid patterns. Still, I feel watched, not by supernatural forces or paranoid delusion, but by a system designed specifically to observe people like me, people who have glimpsed something they weren't meant to see, whose reactions to that glimpse are themselves valuable data. Tonight I'll move again, find another anonymous place to sleep. But before I do, I'll look directly into the nearest screen, television, traffic camera, ATM interface, it doesn't matter which, and I'll acknowledge the observers I know are there, not with fear or defiance, but with the calm recognition that in a world where vulnerable moments can be commodified, the most vulnerable moment of all is the one where you realize you've always been in someone's blind spot, always been visible to eyes you never knew were watching. Imagine discovering that someone has been watching you through your bedroom window for months, filming your most private moments, and selling the footage online to strangers. Now imagine that this isn't happening to just you, but to thousands of people across the country, probably the world, all completely unaware that their lives have become entertainment for perverts with deep pockets. The worst part? It's not some far-fetched nightmare scenario. It's happening right now. I stumbled across it by accident, if you can call 3 months of deliberate searching an accident. I was writing my dissertation on digital privacy and anonymity networks for my media studies degree at Manchester. Proper academic research, you understand. I wasn't some basement dweller looking for thrills. I had ethics approval forms and everything. The Tor browser had been running on my laptop for weeks. I'd bookmarked the usual suspects, a few cannabis marketplaces, some forums discussing encryption, the odd political dissent site. Standard fare for someone studying how people communicate when they don't want to be watched. My supervisor, Dr. Chen, had given me a reading list of academic papers about online anonymity, but I wanted primary sources. Real examples. That's how I found the link. It was buried in a forum post about internet freedom, sandwiched between complaints about government surveillance and discussions of VPN protocols. Just a string of random characters ending in .onion with a single word underneath. Rooms. The site took ages to load. That's normal on Tor. Everything crawls along at the speed of dial-up. When it finally appeared, it looked like something from the early days of the internet. Black background, green text, no images. Just a list of what looked like chat room names, each with a number next to it. The numbers were small, usually single digits. I clicked on one called Yorkshire Evening. The page that loaded had a simple interface, a text box at the bottom, a larger window above showing messages. But there were no messages, just a counter at the top showing 3 viewers and a button that said Request Access. I sat there for about 10 minutes, watching the viewer count fluctuate between 2 and 5. Nothing else happened. No messages appeared, no instructions. Just that green text on black and the gentle hum of my laptop fan. It felt like standing outside a shop with blacked out windows, knowing people were inside but unable to see what they were doing. I tried a few other rooms. Same setup, viewer counts, empty chat windows, that request access button. The names were mundane enough. Brighton Pier, Camden Market, Sunday Roast. They could have been tourism websites or local community groups, but something about the whole thing felt wrong. The way the viewer numbers changed constantly, as if people were flicking between rooms, watching, waiting. After about an hour, I closed the browser and went back to my dissertation. I had enough material about dark web marketplaces and didn't need to go down whatever rabbit hole that site represented. Dr. Chen would be pleased with my chapter on cryptocurrency adoption in illegal markets. That was proper academic work. But I kept thinking about those rooms, the way they just sat there, empty but watched. Over the next few days, I found myself opening the site again, checking the viewer counts, watching the numbers change. It became a habit, like checking social media or the weather. A few minutes here and there between writing chapters and attending seminars. The breakthrough came on a Tuesday evening. I'd been working late in the university library, and when I got back to my flat in Fallowfield, I opened the site almost without thinking. The viewer count on Yorkshire Evening was higher than usual, nearly 20 people, and for the first time, there were messages in the chat window. They weren't conversation exactly, more like coordinates, times and dates, grid references. Someone had posted 53.4 degrees north, 2.2 degrees west, Thursday, 23:30. And others were responding with single words: confirmed, watching, ready. I recognized those coordinates. They were for somewhere in Manchester city centre, near the cathedral, about 15 minutes from where I was sitting. The rational part of my brain knew I should close the browser and forget about it. These were clearly people planning something, and coordinates with specific times suggested it wasn't just chat. But the researcher in me was curious. What were they planning? Was this some kind of urban exploration group? A photography meetup? The coordinates were for a public area. What could they possibly be doing there that required such secrecy? Thursday came and went. I didn't go to the coordinates, but I couldn't stop thinking about them. I found myself checking the news for incidents in Manchester city centre, scanning local police Twitter accounts for anything unusual. Nothing appeared. Whatever had happened, if anything, hadn't made the news. The following week, new coordinates appeared. This time for Liverpool, then Birmingham. Always a major city. Always with that same pattern of confirmations and single-word responses. I started keeping a notebook, writing down the coordinates and times. Not because I planned to do anything with them, but because documenting patterns is what researchers do. The pattern was monthly, third Thursday of each month, around 11:30 at night. Always city centres, always near major landmarks or transport hubs. The coordinates were precise, not just somewhere in Birmingham, but specific to within a few meters. After 3 months of watching, I decided to visit one of the locations. Not during the appointed time, obviously. I wasn't stupid. But I wanted to see what was there, what might draw these people to those specific spots. The coordinates for that month were for a location near Liverpool Street Station in London. Easy enough to visit during the day under the pretense of legitimate research. The location was a small side street off the main road, narrow, with old Victorian buildings that had been converted into flats above shops. During the day, it was busy enough. People cutting through to avoid the crowds on the main street. Workers from nearby offices grabbing lunch. Nothing unusual. Nothing that would explain why someone would choose to meet there at 11:30 on a Thursday night. But as I walked down the street, I noticed something odd. Several of the buildings had small security cameras mounted on the walls. Not the usual CCTV you see everywhere in London, but smaller, more discreet ones. They were angled to cover the street from different positions, creating overlapping fields of view. It struck me that you'd have very comprehensive coverage of anyone walking down that street. I went back to Manchester and thought about what I'd seen. Coordinates, confirmations, a location with extensive camera coverage. It was starting to form a picture I didn't like. The next month, I made a decision that I still regret. I went to the Manchester location at the appointed time. It was raining that Thursday night. the kind of fine drizzle that soaks through your jacket without you noticing. I'd positioned myself about 50 meters from the coordinates in the doorway of a closed shop, where I could see the street but remain hidden. I told myself I was just observing, that I'd leave at the first sign of anything dodgy. At 11:20, a figure appeared at the far end of the street. They walked slowly, deliberately, checking something on their phone. At 25 past, another person arrived from the opposite direction. They didn't acknowledge each other, but both stopped near the exact coordinates I'd written down. By 11:30, there were 5 people standing in roughly the same area. None of them spoke. They just stood there, occasionally glancing around or checking their phones. I was beginning to think this was the most boring conspiracy I'd ever witnessed when I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Each of them was holding a small device, something about the size of a smartphone, but with what looked like a small lens on one end. And they were all pointing these devices in the same direction, toward the residential buildings that lined the street. I followed their gaze and saw what they were looking at. In one of the upper floor windows, there was a light on. Just a normal household light, but in the window, I could see the silhouette of someone moving around, someone who had no idea they were being watched. The group stood there for exactly 30 minutes. Then, without any signal I could detect, they all began to walk away in different directions. The whole thing had taken place in complete silence. I waited until they were all gone before I walked home. My hands were shaking as I unlocked my front door. I just witnessed something that felt deeply wrong, but I couldn't quite put my finger on what it was. A group of people with cameras watching someone's flat. It could have been innocent. Amateur photographers, urban explorers, even researchers like myself. But the secrecy, the coordinates, the synchronized timing, none of that suggested innocent activity. The next day, I went back to the dark website. The viewer count for Yorkshire Evening was back to normal levels, but there was new activity in the chat. People were posting what looked like file names. MCR2311, window4.mp4, MCR2311, kitchen2.ave. The files were followed by strings of numbers and letters, Bitcoin wallet addresses. I realized I was looking at a marketplace. The coordinates weren't meeting points for urban exploration or photography. They were organized surveillance sessions. People were gathering to film strangers in their homes and then selling the footage online. That was disturbing enough. But as I dug deeper into the site, I found something worse. Some of the room names weren't locations at all. They were what looked like names or descriptions. Red hair student, night shift nurse, single mum bedtime. These weren't random voyeurism sessions. They were targeted. Someone was identifying specific individuals and organizing groups to film them. The Bitcoin addresses suggested people were paying for custom content. I felt sick. This wasn't academic research anymore. I'd stumbled into something that was actively harming real people. People who had no idea they were being watched, filmed, and potentially stalked. The rational thing would have been to contact the police, but what would I tell them? That I'd found a website on the dark web where people might be doing something illegal. That I'd witnessed a group of people standing on a street corner with cameras. I had no proof of wrongdoing, no evidence that actual crimes were being committed. Instead, I tried to dig deeper. I wanted to understand the scale of what I'd found, to gather enough evidence to make a proper report. I started monitoring the site more systematically, documenting the patterns, screenshotting the conversations. What I found was worse than I'd imagined. The site wasn't just organizing surveillance. It was a complete ecosystem. People would post requests, descriptions of individuals they wanted filmed. Others would volunteer to do the filming. The footage would be edited and sold. There were even reviews and ratings for the people doing the filming. But the most disturbing part was how organized it all was. This wasn't a few perverts with cameras. There were hundreds of people involved, maybe thousands. The Bitcoin transactions suggested serious money was changing hands. Someone was running this as a business, and the targets weren't random. They were often vulnerable people, students living alone, single parents, people working night shifts. The kind of people who might not notice if someone was watching their flat, or who might not be believed if they reported feeling like they were being stalked. I started having trouble sleeping. Every time I closed my eyes, I thought about those silhouettes in windows, people going about their evening routines, while strangers with cameras watched from the street below. I began checking my own windows obsessively, making sure the curtains were closed, looking for unusual activity outside. The paranoia was probably irrational. I lived in a shared house with 3 other students. We were on the ground floor with a small front garden that would make surveillance difficult. But knowing what I knew about how these people operated, I couldn't shake the feeling that I might be next. That's when I noticed the van. It was parked on my street when I got home from university on a Friday afternoon. Nothing unusual about that. Parking was always tight in our area. But it was still there when I left for the pub that evening, and when I came back around midnight. The next morning, it had moved to a different spot, but it was still on the same street. I probably wouldn't have thought anything of it if not for what I'd learned about the surveillance network. But once you know how these things work, you start seeing patterns everywhere. The van was always positioned where it had a clear view of our house. The windows were tinted, so you couldn't see inside, and it moved regularly, just enough to avoid drawing attention. I started taking photos of it, documenting when it appeared and where it parked. I even walked past it a few times, trying to see if anyone was inside. But the windows were too dark, and I didn't want to be too obvious about looking. After a week of this, I convinced myself I was being paranoid. The van probably belonged to someone who worked in the area or was visiting a friend. I was letting what I'd discovered online affect my perception of reality. That's what happens when you spend too much time staring into the dark corners of the internet. But then I found my address in the site's chat logs. It was buried in a conversation about Manchester targets, listed alongside 2 other addresses in my area. Someone had posted it with a description that matched my appearance and mentioned my university. They knew where I lived, what I looked like, and where I studied. The worst part was the response. Other users were bidding for the surveillance job, offering to provide footage within the week. The highest bid was nearly £200. I'd gone from researcher to target without realizing it. Someone had identified me, probably through my digital footprint, and put me up for sale on their surveillance marketplace. The van outside my house wasn't paranoia, it was reconnaissance. I packed a bag and left Manchester that night, told my housemates I had a family emergency and would be gone for a few weeks. I drove to my parents' house in Chester and stayed there for a month, claiming I needed to focus on my dissertation without distractions. During that time, I tried to report what I'd found to the police. I called the non-emergency number and explained about the dark website and the surveillance network. The officer I spoke to was polite, but clearly didn't understand the technical aspects of what I was describing. He took down my details and said someone would get back to me, but no one ever did. I tried contacting some of the cybercrime units, but without concrete evidence of specific crimes, they weren't interested. What I'd found was disturbing, but it existed in a legal grey area. Standing on public streets with cameras isn't illegal. Selling footage of people in their homes might be, but proving that was happening would require an investigation that no one seemed willing to undertake. Eventually, I had to go back to Manchester to finish my degree. I changed my address, moving to a different part of the city. I bought thick curtains for all my windows and developed a habit of checking the street before leaving my flat. The van never reappeared, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was still being watched. I finished my dissertation on a completely different topic. Dr. Chen was disappointed that I'd moved away from my original research into dark web marketplaces, but I told him I'd found the subject too depressing to continue with. He probably thought I was being oversensitive. The surveillance site is still online. I check it occasionally, using different computers and IP addresses, just to see if it's still active. It is. The room names change, the coordinates shift to different cities, but the pattern continues. People gathering to film strangers, selling the footage to whoever wants to buy it. Sometimes I think about the person I saw in that window in Manchester. The silhouette moving around their flat, completely unaware that 5 people were standing in the street below, recording their every movement. I wonder if they ever found out. I wonder if they ever felt that creeping sensation that someone was watching them, or if they just went about their life, never knowing that their privacy had been violated and sold to strangers online. The thing that disturbs me most isn't the surveillance itself, although that's bad enough. It's how organized it all is, how many people are involved, how much money is changing hands. What I found wasn't some small group of perverts with cameras. It was an industry. And if they could identify me from my digital footprint, if they could find my address and put me up for sale on their marketplace, then they can do the same to anyone. Your address might already be on one of those sites. Someone might already be bidding for footage of you going about your daily routine. You'll probably never know. That's the worst part. You'll never know if that van parked outside your house is just a van, or if someone inside is watching you through tinted windows. You'll never know if that person lingering on the street corner is just waiting for a bus, or if they're pointing a camera at your bedroom window. You'll never know, but now you'll always wonder. And that's exactly what they want. The envelope arrived on a Tuesday morning, mixed in with the usual bills and pizza delivery flyers. No return address, just my name written in careful block letters across cream-colored paper. Inside was a single sheet with a web address I didn't recognize, and a handwritten note that said, "You've been selected. Access granted for 48 hours." I teach secondary school history in Manchester. Nothing particularly exciting about my life. I mark papers, attend staff meetings, and spend most evenings planning lessons about the Industrial Revolution. The most rebellious thing I'd done recently was staying up past midnight to finish a Netflix series, so this mysterious invitation felt completely out of place. My first instinct was to throw it away, probably some marketing scam or university prank. But something about the quality of the paper, the deliberate handwriting, made me hesitate. I'd been feeling increasingly disconnected from the world lately, going through the motions of teaching the same curriculum year after year. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe it was just boredom, but I found myself typing that web address into my browser that evening. The page loaded to a simple login screen. No company logo, no explanation of what the site was for. Just 2 empty fields asking for credentials I didn't have. I tried a few obvious combinations, my email, my name, various passwords, but nothing worked. After about 20 minutes of failed attempts, I gave up and went to bed. The next morning, another envelope was waiting. This time, it contained a username and password, along with a brief message. Time sensitive. Content updates regularly. Viewing ends Thursday midnight. I should have been more suspicious. Normal websites don't send login details through the post, especially not with such cryptic messaging. But there was something intriguing about the whole setup. In my world of lesson plans and parent-teacher conferences, this felt like the beginning of something different. That evening, I logged in successfully. The site looked like a basic video streaming platform, similar to YouTube but with a much cleaner interface. There were maybe a dozen video thumbnails visible, each showing what appeared to be empty rooms filmed from security cameras. The titles were just numbers and letters that didn't seem to follow any pattern. I clicked on the first video. It showed a small, windowless room with concrete walls and fluorescent lighting. There was a single chair in the center and what looked like professional camera equipment mounted around the space. The stream was live, according to a small indicator in the corner, but nothing was happening. Just an empty room with harsh lighting. After a few minutes of watching nothing, I tried another video. This one showed a similar setup, but with different camera angles. Same empty chair, same concrete walls, same sense that I was looking at something I probably shouldn't be seeing. The quality was surprisingly good for what appeared to be hidden camera footage. I spent about an hour clicking through different streams, all showing variations of the same thing. Empty rooms with professional lighting and camera setups. Some had additional equipment I couldn't identify. Metal fixtures attached to the walls, strange contraptions that looked almost medical. The whole thing felt like I was browsing security footage from some kind of experimental facility. What bothered me most was how normal it all seemed. These weren't grainy amateur recordings. The lighting was professional, the camera work was steady, and everything had the polished look of a legitimate production. But legitimate productions of what? I noticed that some videos had viewer counts, usually showing between 5 and 20 people watching at any given time. There were also chat functions, though most of the rooms I looked at had empty chat windows. In one stream, I saw a few messages, but they were in languages I didn't recognize and seemed to be discussing technical aspects of the video quality. By the third evening, I developed a routine of checking the site after dinner. Most of the streams still showed empty rooms, but occasionally I'd see activity. Sometimes it was just someone adjusting camera equipment or testing lighting. Once, I watched someone clean one of the rooms thoroughly, paying particular attention to areas that didn't look dirty to begin with. The pattern started to become clear around the end of my first week of access. The rooms weren't always empty. Late at night, usually after 11, some of the streams would show people entering the spaces. They were always alone, and they never seemed comfortable being there. I told myself these were probably just art installations or experimental film projects. The internet is full of strange performance art, and this could easily be some kind of interactive theatre piece. The people I saw looked like they were participating in something, even if that something wasn't entirely clear to me. But there were details that didn't fit that explanation. The people in the rooms often appeared distressed in ways that seemed too genuine for performance. They would look directly at the cameras with expressions I couldn't quite interpret. Fear, confusion, pleading. If this was acting, it was remarkably convincing. More disturbing was the way the chat functions became active during these sessions. Viewers would send messages that appeared to be instructions or requests. I couldn't understand most of them, but the tone was clearly directive, and somehow the people in the room seemed to be responding to these messages, even though I couldn't see how they were receiving them. I started taking screenshots, telling myself I was just documenting something unusual I'd stumbled across. But really, I think I was trying to prove to myself that this was all somehow legitimate. If I could capture evidence of what I was seeing, maybe I could figure out what it actually was. The breakthrough came during my second week of access. I was watching a stream late one night when I recognized something in the background of one of the rooms. It was just visible at the edge of the camera frame, a distinctive brick pattern that I'd seen before. I teach at a Victorian-era school building, and those same bricks are throughout our basement levels. The school was built in the same period as many buildings in Manchester, so it wasn't necessarily significant. But the pattern was very specific, and seeing it made me start paying closer attention to other architectural details in the streams. Over the next few days, I noticed other familiar elements, a particular style of electrical conduit that was common in older buildings around the city, window frames that matched the ones in my own flat, small details that suggested these rooms weren't in some far-off location, but possibly somewhere quite close to where I lived and worked. The most unsettling realization came when I recognized a person in one of the streams. It was brief, maybe 30 seconds of footage, but I was almost certain I'd seen them before. A woman who looked like someone I'd noticed waiting at the same bus stop I used for my commute to school. Same hair, same build, same nervous way of checking her phone. I told myself it was just coincidence. Cities are full of people who look similar from a distance, and security camera footage isn't exactly high-definition portraiture. But the resemblance was strong enough to make me start paying closer attention to the people around me during my daily routine. That's when I began to notice things I'd never paid attention to before. People at bus stops who seemed to be waiting but never got on buses. Individuals who appeared in multiple locations throughout my usual routes, always alone, always looking slightly out of place. I started keeping a mental note of faces, and patterns began to emerge. There was definitely a connection between the people I was seeing in my neighborhood and the people appearing in these online streams. Not everyone, and not all the time, but enough overlap to make me certain this wasn't happening in some distant location. This was local. The realization should have made me stop watching. Any reasonable person would have closed their browser and tried to forget about the whole thing. But I found myself checking the site more frequently, trying to gather more evidence, trying to understand how such a system could operate so close to normal life without anyone noticing. I started varying my routes to work, taking different buses, shopping at different stores, partially because I was curious to see if the pattern of familiar faces would continue, but also because I was beginning to feel like I might be being watched myself. The paranoia wasn't entirely unfounded. About 3 weeks into my access period, I received another envelope. This one just contained a photograph, a picture of me sitting at my desk at school, taken from outside the building through a window. No message, no explanation, just proof that whoever was running this operation knew exactly who I was and where to find me. I should have gone to the police at that point, but what would I have told them? That I'd been watching mysterious live streams that might be connected to missing persons, that I'd received anonymous mail and felt like I was being followed. I had no concrete evidence of any actual crimes, just a growing collection of screenshots and a growing sense of unease. Instead, I became more careful about my online activity. I started watching the streams less frequently, and when I did log in, I made sure to clear my browser history immediately afterward. I stopped taking screenshots and tried to limit my viewing to times when the rooms appeared empty. But the site seemed to be evolving in response to my changing behavior. New rooms appeared, with setups that were increasingly elaborate. The equipment became more sophisticated, the lighting more professional, and the people appearing in the streams looked less like willing participants and more like they didn't want to be there at all. The chat functions became more active too, with viewers making increasingly specific requests that the people in the room seemed compelled to follow. The language barrier made it difficult to understand exactly what was being requested, but the responses were clear enough. This wasn't performance art or experimental theatre. This was something much more sinister. My access was supposed to end after 48 hours, but the site remained functional well past that deadline. I began to suspect that the initial time limit had been a test of some kind, a way to gauge my level of interest and commitment. The fact that I kept returning, kept watching, had apparently qualified me for extended access. With extended access came new features. I could now see viewer statistics for each room, tracking how many people were watching at any given time. The numbers were higher than I'd expected. Some streams had hundreds of viewers during peak hours. There were also geographical indicators showing where viewers were connecting from, and I was disturbed to see clusters of activity centered around major cities throughout the UK. This wasn't some small-scale operation run by a few individuals. The infrastructure required to support this many concurrent streams, the coordination needed to manage multiple locations, the technical sophistication of the platform. This was a significant criminal enterprise with resources and reach I hadn't initially understood. I started researching missing person reports for Manchester and surrounding areas, trying to see if I could find any correlation with the faces I'd been seeing in streams. The results were more disturbing than I'd expected. There were dozens of recent disappearances, mostly people who lived alone or had limited social connections. People whose absence might not be noticed immediately, or whose disappearance might be attributed to voluntary relocation or lifestyle choices. The pattern wasn't obvious at first, but after several weeks of comparing faces and dates, connections began to emerge. People who'd been reported missing were later appearing in streams, sometimes weeks or months after their disappearance. The timing suggested a systematic approach to recruitment, if that's the right word, for what was happening. I realized I needed to document what I was seeing more systematically. I started keeping detailed records, dates, times, room numbers, descriptions of the people and activities I observed. Not because I had any clear plan for what to do with this information, but because I felt like someone needed to be keeping track. The documentation process made me more aware of just how organized this operation was. There were clear schedules for when different rooms would be active, regular maintenance periods, even what appeared to be staff shifts for the people operating the cameras and equipment. This wasn't chaotic or improvised. It was running like a business. That business model became clearer when I discovered the payment system. Hidden in the site's code were references to premium access levels, private session bookings, and custom content requests. Viewers weren't just passive observers. They were paying customers with specific preferences and the ability to influence what happened in the rooms. I never paid for anything myself, but I could see enough of the system to understand how it worked. Regular viewers could purchase credits that allowed them to make requests during streams. Higher-tier memberships provided access to private sessions and direct communication with the people managing the rooms. The most expensive option appeared to be something called selection services, though I never saw enough detail to understand what that meant. My extended access began to feel less like a privilege and more like a trap. I was seeing too much, learning too much about an operation that clearly went to great lengths to remain hidden. The photograph of me at school hadn't been a friendly reminder. It had been a warning. I tried to stop checking the site, but found myself drawn back repeatedly. Part of it was morbid curiosity. but part of it was a growing sense of responsibility. I was possibly the only person outside the organization who understood the scope of what was happening. If I didn't document it, who would? That sense of responsibility became more urgent when I started recognizing more people from my daily life appearing in streams. A woman who worked at the coffee shop near school. A man who lived in the flat above mine. People who had been part of my routine, my normal world, suddenly appearing in those concrete rooms with their professional lighting and their paying audience. The most chilling realization was that these disappearances weren't random. There was a selection process, a way of identifying and targeting people who fit specific criteria. And somehow, my own behavior, my regular viewing, my documented interest in the streams had potentially marked me as either a customer or a candidate. I don't know which possibility frightens me more, that I might be seen as someone willing to pay for access to more extreme content, or that I might be seen as someone who would make suitable content myself. Both options suggest that my weeks of passive observation haven't been as invisible as I'd assumed. My access to the site ended abruptly last week. I tried logging in with my usual credentials, but the page just showed an error message. I tried the original web address from the first envelope, but it led to a standard page not found error. As far as the internet was concerned, the site had never existed, but I still have my screenshots, my documentation, my growing list of missing persons who appeared in streams before vanishing entirely. I have enough evidence to know that what I witnessed was real, but not enough to prove it to anyone else. I've been thinking about going to the police, but I keep coming back to the same problems. I access the site through credentials that were mailed to me anonymously. I have no way to prove where the footage came from or when it was recorded. Most importantly, I have no way to prove that the site itself ever existed. Without the ability to show investigators the actual streams, my documentation just looks like an elaborate fiction. Screenshots can be faked, missing person reports are publicly available information, and my claims about recognizing local people would be impossible to verify. The smart thing would probably be to forget about the whole experience and go back to my normal routine of teaching and marking papers. But I can't shake the feeling that the operation is still running, still selecting people from the same neighborhoods where I live and work. And I can't stop wondering if my own name is now on some list, if my weeks of watching have qualified me for a different kind of participation. I've been more careful about my routines lately, varying my schedule and staying aware of who might be watching me. But I know that if this organization is as sophisticated as it appeared to be, my precautions probably aren't enough to keep me safe. The worst part is the uncertainty. I don't know if I'm in actual danger, or if I'm just paranoid after weeks of watching disturbing content. I don't know if the people I recognized in streams are actually missing, or if I'm seeing patterns that don't exist. I don't know if the whole experience was real, or if I've somehow convinced myself that something fictional was actually happening. What I do know is that I received those envelopes for a reason, and that reason probably wasn't random selection. Someone identified me as a suitable viewer, someone who would watch without reporting, someone who would become invested enough in the content to keep coming back. They were right about that much. I did keep watching, and I'm still thinking about what I saw. But I suspect they miscalculated what I would do with that information, or how I would react to learning that the operation was happening so close to my own life. I hope I'm wrong about all of this. I hope the streams were staged, the missing people are safely living new lives elsewhere, and my paranoia is just the result of too much isolation and too many late nights staring at disturbing footage. But I don't think I'm wrong, and I don't think this story has an ending yet. everyone has a shadow self, the person we become when no one is watching, when the mask slips and our private thoughts emerge. I always considered mine relatively harmless. Late-night rabbit holes of research on obscure topics, occasionally watching people in cafes, imagining their lives, sometimes typing out angry emails I'd never send. Normal stuff. At least that's what I told myself. I teach digital media studies at a mid-tier university. It's not groundbreaking work, but it keeps me engaged, analyzing how technology shapes communication, behavior, and culture. My research specialty is online community formation, particularly around niche interests. This focus has taken me to some fascinating corners of the internet over the years, though always as an academic observer rather than a participant. 3 months ago, I began a new research project on anonymity and digital identity. The plan was straightforward. Examine how people behave differently in spaces where their real-world identity is disconnected from their online actions. I focused initially on anonymous forums, encrypted messaging platforms, and identity-obscuring applications. Standard academic research conducted within ethical guidelines, with IRB approval and proper protocols. What I didn't include in my research proposal was my growing curiosity about truly anonymous spaces, the layers of the internet inaccessible through standard browsers. I had read the academic literature on so-called dark web networks, understood their legitimate uses for privacy-conscious users, journalists, and dissidents, but I had never actually navigated those spaces myself. It represented a gap in my experiential knowledge, one that increasingly felt like a limitation in my research. So I installed a specialized browser, followed basic security protocols, and began exploring. The experience was initially underwhelming. The dark web resembled the early internet. Text-heavy pages with minimal design, slow loading times, frequent dead links. Most sites were marketplaces for illicit goods, financial services operating outside regulation, or forums discussing privacy technology and philosophy. Nothing particularly shocking or unexpected. About 2 weeks into my exploration, I discovered a subforum dedicated to discussing something called experience rooms. The conversation was deliberately vague, full of insider terminology and oblique references. Members debated the authenticity of various rooms, sharing technical criteria for evaluating legitimacy, but never explicitly stating what these rooms actually contained. The ambiguity intrigued me professionally. It was a perfect example of how communities develop coded language to both include insiders and exclude outsiders. One username appeared consistently in these discussions: Analyst Prime. Unlike most participants who either celebrated or debunked various rooms, Analyst Prime took a clinical, almost academic approach. They discussed psychological profiles of viewers and subjects, reference engagement metrics and response patterns, and occasionally mentioned a research framework they had developed. Their posts contained the kind of analytical language I might use in my own academic work, which perhaps explains why I found them credible when others seemed like sensationalists. After observing the forum for several days, I sent Analyst Prime a private message explaining my research interest in anonymous communities and asking for clarification about these experience rooms they discussed so analytically. I expected to be ignored or rebuffed. Instead, I received a prompt response, asking about my academic background and research methodologies. We exchanged several messages discussing psychology, digital ethnography, and observation bias. Analyst Prime eventually explained that experience rooms were live streaming platforms where viewers could observe people in various situations without the subject's knowledge. Most were fraudulent. pre-recorded content or paid actors pretending to be unwitting participants. But some, they claimed, were genuine. Analyst Prime described themselves as a behavioral researcher studying the psychology of both the observers and the observed in these environments. They offered to show me an authentic room for academic purposes. I should have declined. I should have ended the conversation, deleted the browser, and continued my research through legitimate channels. Instead, I told myself this was a unique research opportunity, a chance to understand a digital phenomenon firsthand, rather than through second-hand accounts. Analyst Prime sent me an address and access credentials for what they called an observation session, scheduled for 2 a.m. the following night. They explained that this particular stream would be appropriate for a first-time academic observer. No illegal activities, no explicit content, just authentic human behavior under observation conditions. They recommended I prepare by reading several psychological papers on voyeurism and surveillance effects, which they linked to normal web academic repositories. The legitimacy of these references lowered my guard further. At 1:55 a.m., sitting in my darkened home office, I accessed the address using the credentials provided. The site had a minimalist interface, black background, a video player in the center, a data panel to the right showing various metrics, and a small text field below for observer notes. No chat function, no visible usernames of other viewers. The video initially showed an empty room, white walls, hardwood floor, a single chair in the center. A timer in the corner indicated the stream would begin in 5 minutes. While waiting, I examined the data panel. It displayed numerous metrics. Current viewer count, 17. Average heart rate of viewers, 72 beats per minute. Average pupillary response, estimated engagement levels, and something labeled empathic resonance score. The sophistication of the analytics suggested serious technology behind what appeared visually to be a simple streaming setup. At precisely 2 a.m., a person entered the frame and sat in the chair. They were ordinary looking, dressed in casual clothes, their face visible but unremarkable. They seemed unaware of the camera, occasionally checking their phone or adjusting their position in the chair. Nothing dramatic or unusual happened. They simply sat, waited, occasionally showing signs of mild impatience or boredom. 10 minutes into this uneventful stream, I noticed changes in the metrics panel. Viewer heart rates had increased slightly. The empathic resonance score was rising. Most notably, my own heart was beating faster despite the mundane scene. A new metric appeared. Anticipation factor, 78%. I couldn't understand why watching someone simply sitting would generate anticipation, yet I felt it too, a growing tension without clear cause. After 20 minutes, the person in the chair checked their watch, stood up, and walked out of frame. The room remained empty for approximately 30 seconds. Then a different person entered and sat down. This new individual also seemed unaware of being recorded, also checked their phone periodically, also displayed mild impatience. The same scenario repeated with no significant variation. What changed dramatically were the metrics. Viewer heart rates increased further. Pupillary response showed significant dilation. The empathic resonance score dropped while anticipation factor rose to 91%. My own physiological response matched these trends. I felt tense, expectant, though nothing objectively tension-inducing was occurring. I recognized this as a conditioned response. Something about this particular setup, an ordinary person waiting alone in a room, had trained regular viewers to anticipate something significant. After 15 minutes, the second person left just as the first had done. The room remained empty again, briefly, before a third individual entered. As this pattern continued, I began to see subtle differences in how each person behaved in the apparently identical situation. Some seemed relaxed, others visibly anxious. Some checked the time frequently. Others seemed content to wait. The observer's metrics fluctuated with each new subject, suggesting viewers were making judgments, forming preferences, developing expectations. The clinical nature of the observation disturbed me more than any explicit content would have. The sophisticated measurement of viewer responses, the controlled environment, the rotation of unwitting subjects. This wasn't amateur voyeurism, but something methodical, researched, purposeful. I was witnessing what appeared to be a psychological experiment with non-consenting participants on both sides. The observed subjects unaware of the viewers, and possibly the viewers themselves unaware of being studied through their physiological responses. After an hour, I closed the stream and immediately sent a message to Analyst Prime expressing ethical concerns about the consent issues involved. Their response came quickly, thanking me for my participation and noting that my observer metrics showed particularly interesting patterns for a first-time viewer. They explained that my heart rate, pupillary response, and attention patterns had been measured through my device's camera, a camera I had never authorized to be activated. I immediately covered my webcam with tape and ran security scans on my system. Finding nothing obvious, I still felt profoundly violated. Analyst Prime sent another message, assuring me that my data would be used anonymously and offering to share the resulting analysis for my own research. They seemed genuinely unable to understand why I might object to being monitored without consent, even while studying others being monitored without consent. The cognitive dissonance was remarkable. I didn't respond to their message. Instead, I uninstalled the specialized browser, documented my experience in an encrypted file, and tried to process what I had witnessed. The next morning, I received an email to my university account, an account I had never shared with Analyst Prime. The subject line read, "Observer Study Follow-up." The message contained a link to what was described as your observer profile based on last night's session. Against better judgment, I clicked the link using a virtual machine on a secure connection. The page displayed a detailed analysis of my viewing patterns during the previous night's stream, which subjects held my attention longest, microsecond measurements of my reactions to specific movements or expressions, comparison of my response patterns to other first-time viewers. Most disturbing was a section labeled Observer Typology Classification that categorized me as a pattern recognition dominant viewer with above-average empathic suppression and researcher consistent cognitive framework. The accuracy of this analysis from just 1 hour of unknown surveillance was deeply unsettling. More troubling was the final section of the report, which predicted with specific probability percentages how likely I would be to discuss the experience with colleagues, 17%, report it to authorities, 12%, return for additional observation sessions, 64%, or attempt to investigate further independently, 89%. The last prediction proved immediately accurate. I began researching experience rooms through legitimate academic databases and cybersecurity resources. Most scholarly references dismissed them as urban legends or scams. Law enforcement bulletins mentioned them only as potential fraud schemes rather than actual surveillance operations. The few credible mentions described them as elaborate role-playing scenarios rather than non-consensual observation. A week later, I received another email, this time containing only a date, time, and link. No message, no explanation. Just another observation session invitation. I ignored it. 3 days after that, another invitation arrived. Then another, The frequency increased to daily, then twice daily. Each invitation came from a different email address, making blocking ineffective. 2 weeks into this escalating pattern, I received something different, a link labeled Subject Perspective. When I accessed it through a secure system, it showed a video feed from my own office, recorded the previous day. The camera angle suggested it came from my computer's webcam, which remained covered with opaque tape. Somehow, they were still watching. I replaced my computer entirely, changed my phone, installed advanced security systems in my home, swept for hidden cameras and microphones, found nothing. Yet the invitations continued, now arriving through text messages, professional networking platforms, even comments on my academic articles, always with a date, time, and link, never with further explanation. After a month of this, I received a different type of message, an observation report similar to my own, but focused on a colleague in my department. It analyzed their viewing patterns, psychological responses, and behavioral predictions in the same clinical format as mine. The message implied that my colleague had been invited to an observation session because of their association with me. The final line read, "Observer networks expand through proximity patterns. Your data suggested 6 high compatibility potential observers in your immediate circle." I confronted my colleague cautiously, asking if they had received any unusual invitations recently. Their confused response confirmed they had no knowledge of what I was describing. I chose not to elaborate, not wanting to draw them further into whatever this was. But the implication was clear. My involvement had somehow marked those around me as potential participants. Yesterday, I received the most disturbing communication yet. Not an invitation or a report, but a video file. It showed a compilation of moments from my daily life over the previous week. Me teaching class, buying groceries, meeting with students, working in my office. Each clip was brief, captured from different angles and distances. Some appeared to come from security cameras or colleagues' devices. Others had no plausible source I could identify. The compilation ended with footage of me sleeping in my bedroom the previous night, shot from an angle that suggested a camera in the smoke detector. The file's metadata included viewing statistics. 27 observers had watched this compilation of my life. Their average heart rate, pupillary response, engagement levels, and empathic resonance scores were listed in precise detail. My existence had become content for the very system I had tried to study. This morning, I discovered a new application on my phone that I never installed. Simply labeled Observer, its icon is a minimalist eye design. I can't delete it. When opened, it shows only a counter currently reading 31 and a timer counting down from 24 hours. I don't know what happens when it reaches 0. I've turned off the phone, but found the same application appearing on my new laptop minutes later. I'm writing this account now as documentation and warning. I don't know who or what Analyst Prime represents. I don't know the purpose of these observation networks or why they focus so intently on expanding through my social connections. What I do know is that the line between observer and observed has completely collapsed in my life. Every moment now exists as potential content, every reaction as data for analysis. The most terrifying realization isn't that I'm being watched, it's that I've begun watching myself through their framework, analyzing my own reactions, considering how they might appear to observers, modifying my behavior to affect the metrics I imagine are being recorded. My internal experience has been colonized by the observation paradigm. I've internalized the clinical gaze that was directed at me. The counter on the Observer app now reads 28. Whatever happens when it reaches 0, I doubt it represents the end of this experience. More likely, it marks a transition to a new phase, perhaps from passive subject to active participant in ways I can't yet imagine. The only certainty is that in a system designed to categorize everyone as either observer or observed, eventually everyone becomes both simultaneously. The feedback loop never ends. It only expands to include more unwitting participants, more data points, more patterns to analyze. It's funny how sometimes the most innocent decisions lead you down the darkest paths. Take my decision to become a night security guard at 34, for instance. I thought I was just taking a quiet job that would give me time to figure out what to do with the rest of my life after the redundancy from the council. Instead, I ended up discovering things about human nature that I wish I could forget. The job was at a small industrial estate in Coventry. Nothing glamorous, just a collection of warehouses and small manufacturing units that needed someone to walk around with a torch and make sure nobody was nicking anything. 12-hour shifts, 4 nights a week, decent pay for essentially doing nothing but staying awake and occasionally checking that doors were still locked. The site office had a proper security setup. Banks of monitors showing feeds from cameras dotted around the estate, a comfortable chair, and most importantly, a decent internet connection. Management had made it clear that as long as I did my hourly rounds and filed the incident reports, what I did with the rest of my time was my business. Perfect for someone trying to work out their next career move. Those first few weeks, I spent the quiet hours browsing job sites and updating my CV, but there's only so much career planning you can do at 3 in the morning before your brain starts craving something more stimulating. That's when I discovered online communities for night shift workers. Forums where security guards, hospital porters, warehouse staff, and various other nocturnal workers would gather to share stories and keep each other company during the long, empty hours. It was through one of these communities that I first heard about the deeper parts of the internet, not the obvious stuff that makes headlines, drug markets, and identity theft, but the more obscure corners where people gathered to discuss things that wouldn't be tolerated on mainstream platforms. Privacy advocates, political dissidents, people who valued anonymity above all else. The appeal was obvious. After spending most of my adult life in local government, where every email was monitored and every website visit was logged, the idea of browsing the internet without leaving digital footprints felt liberating. Like taking off a suit of armor you'd been wearing so long you'd forgotten it was there. The technical side wasn't as complicated as I'd expected. There were guides, tutorials, entire communities dedicated to helping newcomers navigate safely. Within a few nights, I had access to a parallel internet that existed alongside the one most people knew about, invisible and unregulated. Most of it was surprisingly mundane. Forums discussing philosophy and politics, marketplaces selling legal but hard-to-find items, communities of people who simply preferred to communicate without corporate oversight. The criminal element was there certainly, but it felt more like a small part of a much larger ecosystem, rather than the dominant feature the media made it out to be. It was during my 3rd week of exploration that I stumbled across the discussion about live streaming. Someone in a privacy forum had posted a technical question about bandwidth requirements for real-time video over encrypted networks. The conversation that followed was academic in tone, but disturbing in content. They were discussing the feasibility of broadcasting live events to paying audiences without law enforcement being able to trace the source. Red rooms were mentioned only in passing, dismissed by most participants as urban legends that didn't match the technical realities of anonymous streaming. But one poster disagreed, claiming they'd encountered legitimate examples hidden deep within invitation-only networks. They refused to provide details, but something about their matter-of-fact tone suggested they weren't making it up. That comment stayed with me over the following nights. During my hourly rounds, walking between empty warehouses with only my torch for company, I found myself thinking about what might be happening in other buildings, in other cities, in other countries. Places where people gathered to watch things that should never be filmed, let alone broadcast to paying customers. The search took longer than I'd expected. Every obvious lead turned out to be a scam or a honeypot. The deeper I dug, the more sophisticated the gatekeeping became. This wasn't just about knowing the right websites. It was about establishing credibility within communities that valued secrecy above all else. The breakthrough came from an unexpected direction. I'd been helping moderate a forum for night shift workers. Nothing dramatic, just removing spam and settling the occasional disagreement. When I received a private message from someone I'd never interacted with before. They claimed to appreciate my contributions to the community and wondered if I'd be interested in discussing more sensitive topics in a private channel. The conversation that followed was careful, coded, full of references I didn't understand, and questions designed to test my knowledge and intentions. Gradually, it became clear that they were evaluating whether I could be trusted with access to something most people would never see. The invitation, when it finally came, was for a private network that existed several layers deeper than anything I'd encountered before. Access was limited to verified members only, with new users requiring sponsorship from existing participants. The verification process was extensive. Proof of identity, background checks, even references from other members who could vouch for your discretion. It took nearly 2 months to gain full access, and by then I wasn't entirely sure I wanted it anymore. But curiosity had become compulsion, and the same methodical approach that had served me well in local government carried me through the final stages of the approval process. The private network was smaller than I'd expected, maybe 100 active users at most, but the content was unlike anything I'd seen before. They called themselves documentarians, claiming to preserve authentic human experiences that would otherwise go unrecorded. But the experiences they were interested in documenting were things most people would never want to see. The Red Room section was hidden within a subsection marked Live Archives. 3 different providers, each claiming to offer unscripted real-time content featuring genuine participants. The language was clinical, designed to maintain plausible deniability, while making the actual service clear to interested viewers. I spent weeks researching the providers before making contact with one. Their operation appeared professional. Encrypted communications, scheduled sessions, technical support for viewers having connection issues. They operated more like a legitimate streaming service than the criminal enterprise I'd expected. The booking process was surprisingly straightforward. Payment handled through an escrow system that provided guarantees for both parties. I was provided with connection details and technical requirements for a session scheduled for the following Thursday at 2 a.m. When the time came, I found myself sitting in the security office, surrounded by monitors showing empty car parks and darkened warehouses, about to witness something I knew would change how I saw the world. The session began promptly at the scheduled time, connecting me to a live stream that took several minutes to stabilize through the encrypted network. The video quality was poor but functional, showing what appeared to be a small, windowless room with concrete walls. A single chair sat in the center, currently empty, while cameras captured the space from multiple angles. A chat interface allowed communication with other viewers, though the messages were sparse and cryptic. For the first 20 minutes, nothing happened. Just an empty room occasionally flickering as the stream quality adjusted. I was beginning to wonder if this was some kind of performance art, when a figure appeared at the edge of the frame. The man who entered was unremarkable, middle-aged, wearing simple clothing, moving with the casual confidence of someone in familiar surroundings. He spent several minutes adjusting equipment I couldn't see clearly, occasionally glancing at the camera as if checking the feed quality. Then he left, and we were back to watching an empty room. The waiting was almost worse than what came next. Other viewers were using the chat to place bets, make requests, discuss payment options for specific outcomes. I realized I was witnessing something that existed at the intersection of entertainment and crime, where the audience was complicit in whatever was about to happen. When the door opened again, there were two figures. The same man as before, now accompanied by someone much younger. A woman, early 20s perhaps, who seemed confused about where she was or how she'd gotten there. She looked around the room with growing alarm, taking in the cameras and bare walls and single chair with obvious distress. The chat exploded with activity. Dozens of messages appearing faster than I could read them. Viewers making suggestions and placing bets on what would happen next. Bitcoin addresses were being shared. Payments arranged in real time. I watched in horrified fascination as what I was witnessing transformed from observation into participation. The man guided the woman to the chair with gentle but firm insistence. She kept looking directly at the cameras, as if trying to understand what they were recording. Her expression shifted from confusion to fear as the reality of her situation became clear. I should have closed the browser immediately, should have reported what I was seeing, though I had no idea how to explain where I'd found it or whether anyone would believe me. Instead, I found myself paralyzed, unable to look away from something I knew was fundamentally wrong. The man began responding to requests from the chat. He would pause, read something on a screen I couldn't see, then nod or make adjustments to whatever he was preparing. The audience was directing the performance, choosing what happened next through their messages and payments. Then something changed. The steady stream of chat messages stopped abruptly, replaced by a series of warnings from different users. Abort session, abort session, abort session. The man looked directly at the camera, his expression shifting from professional calm to genuine alarm. He moved quickly to something off-screen, and within seconds the video feed cut out entirely. I stared at a blank screen showing only a connection error message. When I tried to reload the page, the entire site was gone. The private network, the forums, even my access credentials, everything had vanished as if it had never existed. Over the following days, I tried to convince myself that what I'd witnessed had been elaborate fiction, a performance designed to extract money from people curious about the darker corners of human nature. The production quality could have been achieved with basic equipment, and everything I'd seen could have been staged by competent actors. But I kept thinking about those final moments before the stream ended, the way the man's demeanor had changed when he'd seen those warning messages, the speed with which everything had shut down. It felt less like a show ending and more like an emergency evacuation. 2 weeks later, I noticed the van. It was parked across from the industrial estate entrance when I arrived for my shift on Tuesday night. Nothing unusual about that. People parked there regularly to use the cash machine at the petrol station next door. But this van was still there when I did my first round at midnight, and again at 1 o'clock, and again at 2. Through the security office windows, I could see it clearly in the light from the street lamps. Dark blue, no markings, windows tinted too dark to see inside. Just sitting there, facing the estate entrance, as if whoever was inside was watching for something. Or someone. The van was there for 3 consecutive nights before it disappeared. During that time, I noticed other things. Cars that seemed to follow the same route past the estate at regular intervals. A jogger who ran the same circuit at 3:30 every morning, always glancing towards the security office as they passed. Small anomalies that individually meant nothing but together suggested a pattern. On the Friday night, after the van had finally gone, I received an email at my personal account. The sender was anonymous, the subject line blank. The message contained only a single line of text. "We know what you watched." Below that was an attachment, a photograph taken through the security office window, showing me sitting at the desk with my laptop open. The image was clear enough to make out details of the screen, though not clear enough to see exactly what I'd been viewing. I deleted the email immediately and ran every security scan I could think of. Changed all my passwords, cleared my browsing history, even formatted the laptop's hard drive. But the damage was already done. Whoever had sent that message had been close enough to photograph me through the office window without triggering any of the motion sensors around the building. That was 6 months ago. I've changed jobs since then. Couldn't concentrate on the security work after that. Kept seeing suspicious vehicles that probably weren't there and hearing footsteps that were likely just the building settling. I work days now, in an office with other people around, where everything feels safer and more predictable. But I still get emails occasionally, never more than once a month, always from different anonymous addresses. Sometimes it's another photograph, my car in the supermarket car park, my flat building taken from across the street, me walking to work on Tuesday morning. Once, it was a copy of my employment records from the security company. Each one carries the same message. "We know what you watched." I don't know what they want from me. Money, silence, complicity. None of it would surprise me at this point. But I've learned that some doors, once opened, can never be closed again. And some audiences never stop watching, even after the show has ended. The thing that bothers me most isn't the surveillance or even the constant feeling of being monitored. It's knowing that somewhere out there, in windowless rooms with concrete walls and multiple cameras, things are still happening that should never be filmed. That people are still gathering online to watch and direct and pay for experiences that exist at the furthest edges of human cruelty. And now I'm part of it, whether I want to be or not. A witness who can't testify. A viewer who can't unsee. Connected forever to something I stumbled across during the long, quiet hours of a night shift in Coventry. Sometimes I wonder if that was always the plan. If the whole thing, the forums, the invitations, the careful vetting process, was designed not just to provide entertainment for paying customers, but to create a network of compromised witnesses, people who'd seen too much to ever feel completely safe again. People like me, who now understand that the worst monsters aren't hiding under beds or lurking in dark alleys. They're sitting in rooms just like the one I'm in now, watching screens that show things no human being should ever have to see.